The school teacher had burned his desk by noon. He fed the legs into the stove one at a time, snapping them at the joints because the axe was outside, and outside was a place no one could stand. 11 children sat on the floor in a half circle, their breath visible, their coats pulled over their knees. The primers went next: arithmetic, geography, a hymnal with a torn spine. Paper burns fast and gives nothing back. The youngest girl pressed her face into an older boy's shoulder and did not lift it. By the time the last bench leg caught, the temperature inside the schoolhouse had dropped to 19 degrees, and the frost on the windows had moved to the inside of the glass. 3 miles west, beneath a cabin floor, a woman opened a hatch and reached into air that smelled like summer. The mud had frozen in ridges around the cabin door, and Ragna had to kick it twice before the frame gave. Inside, the air smelled of cold ash and something older. Wood smoke pressed into every board over 2 winters of burning. The cabin measured 14 by 18 feet. 2 sleeping pallets lay against the north wall. A cast iron stove with a cracked plate sat in the center, its pipe angling through the roof at a pitch her husband had never corrected. Eli stood beside the stove holding her father's work mitten against her chest. Odd sat on the floor with his boots still laced, watching his mother as if waiting for instruction. Torgrim Breka had died 11 days earlier. A storm damaged cottonwood limb, 60 feet of dead heartwood suspended above the cutting line, had separated from the trunk during spring felling and struck him across the back before he heard the crack. 2 men from the next claim carried him home on a plank door. He was conscious long enough to tell Ragna where he had left the splitting maul. Then his breathing changed, and by morning the sound had stopped. She was 28 years old. She had 2 children, 8 and 5. She had a homestead claim 12 miles north of Brookings, Dakota Territory, on a gravelly terrace above the Big Sioux River drainage where cottonwood and willow grew thick enough to cut. She had $18.70 in a tin behind the flour bin. She owed $46.80 to Orrin Voss, the merchant in town who also dealt lumber and brokered fuel. Her final proof hearing for the land patent was scheduled for April. If she abandoned residence before proving up, the claim reverted. If she stayed and could not pay Voss, he could force a sale of the wood that secured the note. And she had 30 cords of split firewood stacked on low rails behind the cabin. 30 cords. 3,840 cubic feet of cottonwood, willow, and ash that Torgrim had felled and split through the previous winter. 10 cords were earmarked for their own household: heating, cooking, livestock water, workshop. 12 cords he had planned to sell through the cold months. 8 cords were promised under handshake agreements to the schoolhouse, the boarding house, and 3 neighboring families who had traded labor for future delivery. The wood was worth more than the cabin, more than the unfinished claim improvements, more than every tool, animal, and piece of furniture Ragna possessed combined. And every stick of it sat outside, stacked in open air, with nothing between it and the Dakota sky except the rails that kept the bottom courses off the mud. Ragna sat at the table that night after the children slept and opened the ruled notebook she kept beside the lamp. She turned past pages of rainfall measurements, frost dates, and wind directions. Entries she had maintained since the first autumn on the claim, and wrote the numbers that would govern the next 7 months of her life. Cash, $18.70. Debt, $46.80 due November. Wood needed for household, 10 cords. Wood available for sale or delivery, 20 cords. Patent hearing, April. Rail passage east for 3 people, more than she had. Relatives within reach, none. She closed the notebook and pressed both palms flat against the table. The lamp threw her shadow across the sleeping children. Outside, the woodpile stood pale in the last light, and somewhere along the river, a coyote tested the silence with a single rising note that nobody answered. August Venn arrived on the fourth morning after the burial. He came on a freight wagon with iron-rimmed wheels that cut ruts in the softening road, and he did not dismount immediately. He sat on the seat and looked at the property the way a man looks at a hand of cards he has already decided to fold. Venn was 61, the township road overseer and a veteran freight driver who had survived the hard winter of 1880 to 81, when snow buried the territory and families burned furniture, fence posts, and twisted hay to stay alive. He had authority in the settlement, not because anyone elected him to it, but because he had endured things that killed other men, and endurance on the plains was the only credential that mattered. He stepped down and walked the claim without asking permission. He pointed at the cabin. 2-floor joists remained unbraced where Torgrim had planned to reinforce them before winter. The gap was visible from outside, a sag in the south wall that let wind whistle through the boards when the temperature dropped. He looked at the stove through the open door. The cracked plate would hold for perhaps one more season if no one pushed the fire too hard, but a hard frost night with the damper wide would split it further, and a split plate meant smoke inside and heat escaping. He walked behind the cabin to the woodpile. 30 cords is not a small thing to see. Stacked 4 feet high on rails spaced 8 feet apart, the rows stretched 60 feet along the back of the property. The bark was weathered silver on the exposed faces, but where splits showed the interior grain, the wood was still pale, seasoned, dry, light enough that Ragna could judge a billet's moisture by lifting it. Torgrim had done his work well. The wood was good. Venn pulled a billet from the second course and turned it in his hands. He tapped the end grain with his knuckle. The sound came back clean and sharp. No dull thud of trapped water. He replaced it and looked at the sky, then at the cabin, then at Ragna. "You have 2 unbraced joists," he said. "You have no enclosed woodshed. You have a stove plate that will not last 2 hard winters. You have 30 cords on open rails and a banknote secured partly against the wood." He paused. "And you have a river crossing that becomes killing ground after freeze-up." Ragna said nothing. "A woodpile does not raise children, Mrs. Brecka." Venn's voice carried no malice. He spoke the way men spoke when they believed the conclusion was already settled, and the only question was how long the other person would take to reach it. "Sell it before weather and pride ruin both." "Sell to whom?" Ragna asked. "Voss will take the lot." "Voss will pay 50 cents on the dollar and require me to vacate the claim." Venn looked at her. "He will pay what the market sets." "The market is one buyer," Ragna said, "and the buyer holds my debt." Venn had no answer for that because there was no answer. In a settlement 12 miles from the nearest rail town, with roads that turned to mud in spring and ice in winter, the number of people who could purchase 30 cords at fair value and transport them was exactly 1, Orrin Voss. And Voss had made his position clear before the grave dirt settled. Venn climbed back onto the wagon. He gathered the reins and then stopped, as if one more thing had occurred to him. "Your husband cut good wood," he said. "That is not the same as surviving what comes after." The wagon pulled away. Wagon pulled. Ragna watched it until the sound of the wheels disappeared into the distance, and then she looked at the woodpile again. 30 cords. 3,840 cubic feet of fuel that could heat her family, pay her debt, honor the delivery contracts, and prove that the claim was productive enough to earn its patent. If it stayed dry, if it stayed accessible, if winter did not do what winter always did to things left in the open. She went inside and wrote in the notebook. Venn says sell. Voss is the only buyer. Voss wants the land. Below that, She wrote a question she could not yet answer. Where does 30 cords go when there is no shed and no money to build one? 3 days later, Orrin Voss nailed a notice to her door. Ragna was at the river with the children when he came. She found the paper when they returned, a single sheet stating that if payment on the $46.80 note was not received by November 15th, Voss reserved the right to seize the collateral wood and pursue additional remedies against the claim improvements. The language was formal. The intent was not complicated. Voss wanted the wood, or the land, or both. He had extended credit to Torgrim for hardware, lamp oil, nails, and provisions over 2 seasons, and the debt was real. What was also real was that the 30 cords sold at full winter price were worth 3 times the debt, and the land beneath the cabin, once patented, would be worth more than everything else combined. Ragna read the notice twice. Then she folded it and placed it in the notebook beside her calculations. Eli asked what the paper said. "It says Mr. Voss would like his money," Ragna answered, "and we are going to give it to him, but not the way he expects." That night she could not sleep. She lay on the pallet and listened to the wind testing the unbraced joists and thought about every woodpile she had ever seen on the Dakota plains. Every family stored fuel the same way. Rails or skids on the ground, billets stacked 4 feet high, open to the air on at least 2 sides. Some built a simple roof, 2 posts, and a plank lean-to, but most did not because enclosed lumber cost money, and the conventional wisdom said that air circulation kept the wood dry. And it did. Air circulation kept seasoned wood dry through ordinary weather. Rain fell, wind dried the surfaces, sun baked the ends, and the billet seasoned further as summer turned to autumn. Snow was manageable. A well-stacked pile shed snow the way a roof shed rain, and what accumulated on top could be knocked clear with a pole. But Ragna had watched what happened when the weather was not ordinary. She had seen wind-driven rain penetrate 3 courses deep into a stack, soaking billets that took weeks to dry. She had seen a sudden freeze after warm rain bind the outer courses together so tightly that a man needed a pry bar to separate them. She had seen cottonwood, already soft, already prone to absorbing moisture, turn dark and heavy after a single autumn storm, and she had listened to it hiss and spit on the stoveplate for hours before it gave up enough water to burn properly. Every family on the plains trusted their winter fuel to remain accessible. Every family assumed that what they stacked in September would still be reachable in January. Ragna stared at the ceiling and asked the question that would not leave her alone. Why does everyone assume that? She did not have an answer yet, but the question was enough to keep her awake until the first gray light came through the window and Odd began stirring on his palette, and by then she had written 3 more pages in the notebook, and the pages were full of numbers. The idea did not arrive as a single revelation. It built itself slowly through the month of August, one observation at a time, until the shape of it was too clear to ignore. The trigger was rain. A thunderstorm broke over the claim on the 14th of August. The kind of plain storm that turns the sky green and drops water so heavy it sounds like gravel on the roof. Ragna needed potatoes for supper. She lifted the hatch in the kitchen floor and climbed down into the shallow food cellar that Torgrim had dug the first autumn on the claim. The cellar was rough, stone-lined on 3 sides, open earth on the 4th, with a dirt floor and a ceiling so low she had to duck beneath the joists. It held potatoes, turnips, a crock of salted pork, and 3 jars of preserves. It smelled like damp stone and the faint sweetness of root vegetables stored in sand. But it was dry. Rain hammered the roof above her. She could hear it sheeting off the eave and drumming into the mud outside. Through the walls of the cellar, nothing. The entrance faced away from the prevailing wind, and the floor. She noticed this for the first time with the attention of someone looking for answers. The floor sloped slightly toward the downhill wall, where a gap between stones let any collected water seep into the gravel beneath the terrace. She stood in the cellar with a potato in one hand and listened to the storm, and a memory rose so completely that she could feel the cold iron latch beneath her fingers. Her father's cellar. The farm in Minnesota before the move west. She was 9 or 10. Her father, a man who measured everything twice and spoke about buildings the way other men spoke about horses, had maintained a ventilated potato cellar that was the best kept structure on the property. She remembered standing beside him while he pressed one palm against the frost-white outer door and the other against the dry stone wall inside. The difference in temperature was enormous. Winter outside, autumn inside. The air smelled of pine slats and earth, and the faint sweetness of stored potatoes. He had tapped the ventilation shaft with his knuckle, the way another man might tap a barometer. Earth slows the cold, he told her. Air keeps the store alive. Water must always be given somewhere else to go. She had filed the lesson the way children file adult knowledge, without urgency, without understanding why it might matter. 20 years later, standing in a rough Dakota cellar, while rain destroyed the accessible surface of her only asset, the lesson unfolded itself into something specific enough to sketch. She climbed out of the cellar and stood in the kitchen doorway. Through the rain, she could see the woodpile. Water was blowing sideways into the stacks, penetrating the outer courses, darkening the exposed grain. Every billet that absorbed water today would burn worse tomorrow, and if that water froze before it dried, the billets would lock together like stones in a wall. Ragna went to the table and began to draw. The first sketch was wrong. She drew a sealed pit, a rectangular hole beneath the cabin with the wood stacked inside and a hatch on top. Simple, contained, protected from wind and rain, and potentially lethal. A sealed pit would trap moisture from the wood itself, from the soil, from any groundwater that found its way through the walls. The humidity would rise until the wood was wetter underground than it had been in the rain. Mold would follow within weeks. The billets would rot from the inside, and by midwinter she would open the hatch to find 30 cords of soft, stinking waste. She crossed out the drawing and started again. The second sketch separated the problems. The wood needed to be underground, but the underground space needed to behave like the surface on a good day. Dry, ventilated, drained. It needed to be below the frost line to avoid the freeze-thaw cycle that locked outdoor stacks, but it needed moving air to prevent the moisture buildup that ruined sealed spaces. It needed an entrance that ice could not seal, which meant the entrance had to be inside the cabin, through the floor, where the warmth of the room kept the hatch clear even in the worst cold. The design that emerged over 3 nights of lamplight revision contained 7 elements. A small chamber directly under the kitchen, accessible through the existing food cellar hatch. A larger storage wing extending from the kitchen chamber into the adjacent rise beside the cabin. Not a tunnel, but an excavation driven horizontally into the slope. The kitchen hatch as the sole winter entrance, so that ice forming on exterior surfaces could never seal the access point. Raised racks inside to keep billets off the soil. 8 inches of clearance beneath the lowest cores. Ventilation openings at high and low points, with wooden shutters to restrict airflow in severe cold. A stone-lined drain channel sloping from the floor toward the exposed face of the terrace, so that any water entering the space would flow downhill and out. Load-bearing frames independent of the cabin's floor joists, so the weight of the earth above the storage wing would not transfer through the cabin structure. The core principle was not underground warmth. A winter cellar in Dakota Territory would hold temperatures in the upper 30s or low 40s, while the surface dropped below zero. Warmer than the air, but not warm. The principle was the combination: stable temperature, controlled dryness, active drainage, and protected access. The wood would not be warm, it would be reachable, it would be dry, and it would burn. Ragna marked one cord on the ground outside the cabin the next morning, 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet. She paced the measurement twice, then multiplied. 30 cords required 3,840 cubic feet of interior volume. She wrote the number and stared at it. An ordinary root cellar could not hold it. The food cellar beneath her kitchen was perhaps 60 cubic feet. She needed 64 times that volume. Her final target, sketched on the last clean page of the notebook, was a vault measuring 32 feet long by 24 feet wide with an 8-foot structural depth. The wood would occupy roughly 62% of the interior space. The remaining 38% was not waste. It was the architecture of access. A 3-foot center aisle, support frames, air gaps between the stacks and the walls, drain channels, a loading passage from the exterior summer door. A stone separation wall beneath the kitchen to isolate the living space from the stored fuel. She had never built anything like it. She had never seen anything like it. She was designing a structure that would bear the weight of several feet of packed earth and sod on its roof while remaining dry, ventilated, and accessible through a hatch in her kitchen floor. The doubt arrived on schedule. It came in the voice of every man who had ever told her what she could not do, and it sounded exactly like August Venn standing beside his freight wagon, looking at her property the way a man looks at a losing hand. She wrote one more line in the notebook. I know storage. I do not know shoring. Clara Hume found her pulling up floorboards. Clara lived on the adjacent claim with 3 children and a husband who worked seasonal railroad labor and would not return until October. She was 34, practical, strong-armed, and constitutionally unable to see unusual activity without investigating it. She arrived with her oldest daughter and stopped at the cabin door, watching Ragna lever a board free with the back of the splitting maul. "What are you doing to your floor?" Clara asked. "Expanding the cellar." "For what?" "Wood." Clara stepped inside and looked through the gap where 2 boards had been. The food cellar was visible below, stone walls, packed earth, the smell of root vegetables. She looked at Ragna the way a person looks at someone who has just announced a plan to walk to the Pacific Ocean. "You need a roof over the pile," Clara said. "Not a mine beneath your bed." Ragna set the maul down. A roof stops falling rain. It does not stop wind-driven water, drifting sleet, or an entrance frozen shut. A roof over 30 cords of wood requires posts, beams, and planking I cannot afford. A roof still leaves every billet exposed to horizontal weather and temperature swings that freeze the stack solid. And digging a cellar the size of a barn will be safer? No, Ragna said. Not yet. Clara pointed at the gap in the floor. If the soil shifts beneath this cabin, you will bury yourself and your children. You understand that. I understand that. Then who is going to teach you how to hold up several tons of earth without killing everyone in the house? Ragna did not answer because she did not have an answer. The design was sound. The physics were real. Her father's cellar had proven the principle, and the food cellar proved it again every time she climbed down into dry air while rain hammered the roof. But a food cellar held potatoes. This held 30 cords. The volume difference was the difference between a garden and a quarry, and she had never placed a structural support in her life. Clara left with the same expression Ven had worn, not hostile, but finished, as though the conclusion had been reached, and only the other person's stubbornness prevented her from seeing it. Ragna replaced the floorboards and sat at the table. She had given herself until the first week of November. If the vault was not safe and dry by then, she would abandon the project and sell the wood to Voss at whatever price he set. She would lose the claim, lose the contracts, lose the future she had planned with Torgrim. But her children would be fed, and the wood would not rot in a hole she was not qualified to dig. She wrote the deadline in the notebook and circled it twice. 7 weeks. Perhaps 8 if the weather held. And somewhere in those weeks she needed to find someone who knew how to keep the earth from caving in. The soil appeared first. Barrow loads of dark, gravel-streaked earth began accumulating beside Ragna's cabin in the last week of August. She worked with a short-handled spade and a wooden barrow that Torgrim had built for hauling manure, and she moved dirt the way women on the plains moved everything, steadily, without rest breaks that lasted long enough for doubt to settle. She was not digging the vault yet. She was opening the preliminary cut into the terrace beside the cabin, the surface excavation that would eventually become the longer storage wing. The design called for most of the construction to happen as cut and cover. Dig down from the surface, build the walls and roof frames in the open trench, then backfill and replace the sod on top. This was safer than tunneling and required less specialized knowledge, but it required more digging and more time. The barrow loads attracted attention. At Voss's general store, where every transaction became public knowledge, and every purchase told a story about the buyer's plans, the topic of Ragna Brekka's excavation became a reliable source of amusement. Voss himself introduced the first label. He stood behind the counter while 2 customers examined her account ledger, which he kept visible as a reminder of who owed what, and said the words that would follow her through the autumn. Brekka's underground forest. The phrase traveled the way phrases travel in small settlements, repeated at the feed barn, modified at the boarding house, distorted at the schoolhouse gate. Within a week, it had become the widow's wood grave. People used it the way they used all nicknames for projects they considered doomed, with affection on the surface and dismissal underneath. The objections were specific and reasonable. Cellars are damp. Everyone knew this. Food sellers worked for potatoes and turnips because those crops tolerated humidity. Wood did not. Cottonwood was especially vulnerable. Soft-grained, porous, and inclined to absorb moisture like a sponge if given the opportunity. A damp underground chamber would mold 30 cords faster than the weather would freeze them. Fire beneath a cabin. Ragna planned to store fuel directly beneath her living space, separated by floorboards, joists, and a stone wall. If a spark traveled through the hatch, if lamp oil spilled, if a child carried an ember down the ladder, the fire would rise through the floor, and the family would die before they could reach the door. Structural collapse. A woman with no construction experience was digging a hole larger than most buildings in the settlement, directly adjacent to a cabin with already weakened floor joists. If the excavation undermined the foundation, an excavation next to existing structures routinely destabilized them. The cabin would settle, crack, and potentially collapse. Ragna could not simply dismiss these concerns because each one identified a genuine failure point. The cellars she had seen were damp. Fuel near an occupied space was dangerous. Unsupported excavation killed experienced miners and construction workers every year. The skeptics were not inventing fears. They were naming the exact ways the project could fail. But naming the failure points was not the same as proving they could not be addressed. And Ragna had spent 3 weeks drawing drainage channels, ventilation paths, and fire separations precisely because she already understood what could go wrong. The problem was that understanding design and executing construction were not the same thing, and the people who could see that gap most clearly, Clara, Ven, the neighbors, were the same people whose help she needed most. Voss came in person on the second day of September. He arrived in a light buggy with a leather case on the seat beside him and the specific posture of a man conducting business he expected to conclude in his favor. Orrin Voss was 44, clean-shaven, and careful about his appearance in a settlement where most men wore the same clothes until the fabric surrendered. He sold hardware, provisions, lamp oil, nails, and lumber. He brokered fuel during the winter months, buying from cutters at summer prices and selling to desperate families at winter rates. He held notes on half the claims within 15 miles. He was not a villain in the way stories require villains. He was a businessman in a place where business operated without competition, which meant that his prices were whatever he said they were and his terms were whatever he wrote down. The absence of alternatives made him powerful. The presence of debt made him patient. He could wait for Ragna to fail because time was on his side and the note was in his pocket. He did not look at the excavation first. He looked at the woodpile. Then he walked to the cabin, sat at the table without being invited, and opened the leather case. Inside was a written offer, $24 against the $46.80 debt. He would accept the wood and land improvements as full settlement. He would provide winter lodging for the children in exchange for Ragna's domestic labor at the boarding house. He would take immediate possession of the entire woodpile. Ragna read the document while Voss waited. The terms were clear. If she signed, the debt disappeared. The children would have a warm room for the winter. She would work as a servant in the town her husband had intended to supply as a fuel merchant. And the claim, the land, the cabin, the patent application would pass to Voss for the cost of $24 and a season of room and board. "The excavation concerns me," Voss said. He had the measured tone of a man who had practiced his reasonableness. "Your activity is reducing the value of the claim. It may violate the terms of the note, which specifies that collateral be maintained in marketable condition." "The wood is on rails behind the house," Ragna said. "The excavation is beside the house. The collateral has not moved." "The collateral sits above a growing hole." Voss folded his hands. "Mrs. Brecka, I am offering you a path that preserves your children's health and your own reputation. A widow who acknowledges her limitations is respected. A widow who buries herself in a pit is pitied." Ragna placed the document on the table and slid it back toward him without signing. Voss stood. He collected the case. At the door, he turned. "I will instruct my suppliers that your account is closed. No nails, no planking, no lamp oil on credit." He put on his hat. "When November comes, you will sign, or the law will settle the matter for both of us." He left. Ragna sat at the table and listened to the buggy wheels fade. Eli appeared in the doorway to the sleeping area, holding a rag doll against her chest. She had heard everything. Children on homestead claims always heard everything because the walls were thin and the rooms were small, and the adults who believed their conversations were private were the only ones who believed it. "Are we leaving?" Eli asked. "No," Ragna said. "We are not leaving." She went outside and picked up the spade. The social cost accumulated quietly. Clara stopped lending her horse for the heavy hauling. She said the animal had a sore hoof, which was true, but the real reason lived in the conversation she had with her husband's brother at the store. "If that cabin falls and the horse is under it, who pays?" Parents told children not to play near the excavation. The cut was 3 feet deep in places, with unsupported walls and loose soil along the edges. It was genuinely dangerous, and the parents were genuinely right. August Venn asked the township board to inspect the site. The board consisted of Venn and 2 other men who farmed neighboring claims. They walked the perimeter of the cut, looked at the cabin's proximity to the open trench, and told Ragna she had until the first significant rain to shore the walls or fill the hole. She worked alone. On the 7th day of September, a section of the trench wall slumped after a half-inch rain. The collapse was small, perhaps 2 barrow loads of soil sliding into the cut, but it knocked a temporary roof frame sideways. The frame caught Ragna's boot and pinned her foot against a stone at the bottom of the trench. She could not pull free. The leather was wedged beneath the timber, and the timber was braced against the opposite wall by the weight of the displaced earth. She cut the boot leather with her belt knife and freed herself. The boot was ruined. Her ankle throbbed for 3 days. The incident proved exactly what the skeptics had been saying. She was working alone in an unsupported excavation adjacent to an occupied cabin, and the first minor collapse had trapped her. If the children had not been within shouting distance, if the collapse had been larger, if the timber had landed across her leg instead of her boot. She did not finish the thought. She did not need to. The thought was the same one that woke her at 3 in the morning and sat beside her at the table while she revised the drawings. I know storage. I do not know shoring, and the earth does not forgive what I do not know. Pater Kwame came on the 11th of September. He did not come because anyone sent him. He came because he had been walking the road from the river crossing, and he had seen the excavation from 200 yards. The straight lines of the survey stakes, the measured corners, the systematic removal of soil in sections rather than the random gouging of someone who was simply digging a hole. He was 58 years old, Norwegian-born, a carpenter by trade, and a former railway grading foreman who had spent years building timber shoring, drainage cuts, culverts, and temporary bridges across terrain that wanted to collapse. His left hand was missing the last joints of 2 fingers, crushed beneath a drop tie beam in 1879. His right knee had been damaged when a grading embankment shifted and swept him into a drainage ditch. He could walk. He could demonstrate. He could supervise. He could not dig for hours or lift heavy timbers into position. He stood at the edge of the trench and looked at the work the way Venn had looked at the cabin, but the conclusion he reached was different. He saw the squared corners. He saw the marked depth lines scratched into the exposed wall. He saw the drainage direction. Ragna had oriented the cut so that water would flow downhill toward the terrace face, not back toward the cabin. He saw the systematic removal pattern, surface sod stacked separately from subsoil piled where it could be used for backfill, stones sorted by size. He looked at all of this for a long time. Then he looked at Ragna, who was standing at the top of the cut with the spade in one hand and a ruined boot on the other foot, and he asked the question that changed everything. "Who taught you to square a hole?" Ragna met his eyes. "No one taught me to square a hole. I taught myself to measure." Pater looked at the cut again. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the unsupported walls where the slump had occurred, and his expression shifted from curiosity to something harder, the look of a man who recognized competence and recklessness in equal measure. "You measured well," he said. "Then you dug without shoring, and the earth showed you what it thinks of measurements without bracing." He did not offer to help, not that day. He asked to see the drawings. Ragna brought the notebook. Pater sat on the edge of the cut and turned pages slowly. He did not speak for 10 minutes. He traced the drainage channel with his crushed finger. He tapped the ventilation shafts. He paused at the load-bearing frame calculations and looked up. "Where did you learn about post spacing?" "I watched my father build a cellar, and I watched my husband frame this cabin. Your husband spaced his joists too far apart." "I know." Pater closed the notebook. He looked at the sky, then at the woodpile, then at the terrace slope where the storage wing was intended to extend. "The design is not wrong," he said. "The sequence is wrong. You are removing earth before supporting what is above you. If you continue this way, you will lose the wall, then the cabin corner, then your life." He stood, and his knee made a sound that Ragna heard from 6 feet away. "I will come back tomorrow," he said. "Stop digging." He walked away without looking back. Ragna watched him go and felt something she had not felt since Torgrim died. Not hope, exactly, but the specific relief of hearing someone describe her problem in terms that included a solution. She did not dig. She waited. And the next morning, before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, Peter Kvamer returned with a canvas bag of tools that clinked like church bells when he set it down beside the trench. Tell us in the comments, have you ever had to prove something to people who had already decided it could not work? The first thing Peter did was order Ragna away from the cabin. Not permanently, not from the project, from the trench beneath the kitchen. He walked the perimeter of the under-cabin excavation, pressed his palm against the exposed soil wall, and scraped it with his thumbnail. Gravel and clay mixed in layers. Some sections would hold shape, others would fracture if moisture reached them. "Stop digging here," he said. "The cabin carries weight. The weight presses down. Remove the earth that carries the weight, and the weight finds a new path, usually through whatever is beneath it." He drove a narrow test trench into the terrace slope, 10 feet from the cabin, 3 feet deep, 2 feet wide. Then he demonstrated. He placed 2 boards across the cut, resting on the soil at each edge. He stacked stones on the boards until the weight was visible in the way the planks bowed. Then he removed one supporting edge of soil from beneath the left board. The frame twisted. The stones shifted. One rolled into the trench. "This is your cabin," he said, pointing at the twisted boards. "This is your floor. Those are your children." The lesson was not subtle, and Peter did not intend it to be. His first rule arrived with the weight of every embankment failure, every drainage collapse, every railway cut that had shifted beneath men who assumed the earth would stay where they left it. Support what is above you before taking away what is below. They began again. Not from the beginning. The surface cut beside the cabin was still usable, but from a different sequence. Peter's revised construction order started outside and worked inward. First, complete the exterior cut for the larger storage wing. Dig from the surface, in the open, where a wall collapse meant losing dirt, not losing the cabin. Second, build the storage wing's walls and roof framing in the open cut, where they could be inspected, adjusted, and tested before any earth was placed on top of them. Third, join the storage wing to the kitchen chamber through a connecting passage. Fourth, shore the small under-kitchen chamber only after the main wing was completed and proven, using the wing structure as an anchor. Fifth, add drainage, waterproofing, and ventilation. Sixth, backfill and replace sod over the wing. Seventh, load wood through the exterior summer door while it remained accessible. Eighth, seal the summer door before freeze-up, leaving the kitchen hatch as the sole winter entrance. The method preserved the subterranean design while eliminating the most dangerous element, hand digging beneath an occupied cabin without structural support. Ragna listened to the sequence and understood immediately what it meant for the schedule. The revised approach was safer. It was also slower. Every step depended on the one before it. If the open-cut framing took longer than expected, the backfill would be delayed. If the backfill was delayed, the summer door would remain open into cold weather. If the door remained open, the vault would be exposed to exactly the conditions it was designed to prevent. November 1st. That was the deadline she had set. If the vault was not closed, loaded, and sealed by the first week of November, the project was finished and Voss won. She looked at the calendar scratched into the inside of the cabin door. September 11th. 51 days. Peter saw her counting. How fast can we work? She asked. Faster than you were working, he said. Slower than you need. He pulled a folding rule from his canvas bag and began measuring the terrace face. The morning light was already warm, and somewhere above them a hawk turned in the air without moving its wings, riding something invisible that carried it north. 51 days. And the first post was not yet in the ground. Peter Kavama did not work the way Ragna expected. She had imagined a man who would take the spade from her hands and dig faster, harder, longer, a man whose body would replace the labor she could not produce alone. What arrived instead was a man who touched the soil the way a physician touches a wound, carefully, with information flowing through his fingertips into a diagnosis that changed everything about the treatment. On the first morning, he spent 40 minutes walking the terrace slope. He pushed a sharpened stick into the ground at intervals and examined what came up on the tip. He crumbled soil between his fingers and smelled it. He poured water from a canteen onto 3 different spots along the proposed cut line and watched how quickly it disappeared. Gravel over clay, he said. The gravel drains, the clay holds. Where they meet, water runs sideways. He drove a stake at the point where the clay layer surfaced on the exposed terrace face. That was where the drain channel would exit, not where Ragna had drawn it, but 14 inches lower, following the natural boundary between the 2 soil types. Water does not read drawings, he said. It reads the ground. He moved 3 of her layout stakes. The vault's footprint shifted 4 feet south, aligning the long axis with the slope's natural drainage fall. The kitchen connection angled differently. The summer loading door moved to a spot where the terrace face was steepest, which meant the exterior approach ramp could drain itself during construction rather than collecting every rainstorm in a muddy pool at the bottom. Ragna watched these changes with the expression of a person seeing their own handwriting corrected by someone who writes in the same language, but with a fluency she had not yet earned. The design is yours, Peter said, as if reading the thought. The ground is mine. They developed a rhythm across the 2nd and 3rd weeks of September. Ragna dug. Peter directed. The distinction was not about strength. Peter's damaged knee and crushed fingers limited his capacity for sustained labor, but his upper body remained powerful enough to demonstrate any technique once. He showed Ragna how to undercut a section of soil wall at the base, so the upper section fell cleanly, rather than crumbling in stages that left unstable overhangs. He showed her how to brace a temporary wall with angled timbers before removing the adjacent section. He showed her how to read the sound of a spade hitting different substrates, the ring of gravel, the thud of clay, the hollow scrape of soil about to shift. Each lesson arrived through action, not explanation. Peter would demonstrate once, watch Ragna repeat the movement, correct her angle or timing with a single word, and move on. He did not praise. He did not reassure. He worked with the assumption that she was capable of learning everything he showed her, and the absence of doubt in his instruction was more encouraging than any compliment could have been. The undercabin chamber came last in the revised sequence, but the exterior cut for the main storage wing demanded its own shoring as the walls deepened. When the open trench exceeded 4 feet, Peter installed the first temporary bracing. Horizontal planks held against the soil walls by angled struts wedged against the opposite side. Cross bracing, he said. Every 2 feet of wall height. Miss 1, and the next rain takes the wall and the brace above it. They used lumber salvaged from the abandoned claim shanty 3 miles east. The boards were weathered but sound, and Ragna traded a day of hauling for the right to strip whatever she could carry. Peter inspected each board, discarding anything with soft spots, splits wider than a thumbnail, or nail holes that weakened a load-bearing section. The work was measured in barrow loads. Ragna counted them the way she counted everything. By the end of the second week, she had removed 412 loads from the exterior cut. Each load weighed roughly 80 pounds. She had moved 32,960 pounds of earth with a spade, a barrow, and the kind of persistence that people in the settlement mistook for stubbornness because they could not see the numbers behind it. Her palm split during the third week. The left palm cracked along the base of the fingers where the spade handle rubbed, and the crack deepened until the skin separated and the raw tissue beneath wept fluid that mixed with dirt and formed a paste she could not wash clean. She wrapped the hand in a strip of flour sackcloth and continued digging. By the fourth day, the wrapping smelled wrong. The wound had become inflamed, hot to the touch, swollen at the edges, and painful enough that gripping the spade handle sent a shock up her forearm that made her eyes water. Pater noticed before she mentioned it. "Show me." She unwrapped the hand. The wound was red beyond the edges of the original crack, and a yellowish film covered the deepest part. "You will lose the hand," Pater said, "or you will stop using it for 3 days." "I do not have 3 days." "Then you will lose the hand in the vault and the claim, and the children will sleep in Voss's boarding house by Christmas." Ragna stopped digging with the left hand. She used the right for 2 days and let Eli bring warm salt water 3 times daily to soak the wound. The inflammation receded slowly. The 3 days became 5 before she could grip without flinching. During those 5 days, Pater worked alone. His knee would not allow him to dig, but he cut and fitted temporary bracing, shaped the drain channel stones, and built the first 2 permanent post and cap frames from peeled cottonwood logs 8 to 10 inches in diameter. Each post stood on a broad field stone footing that spread the load across the trench floor. The cap beams, horizontal timbers connecting the tops of opposing posts, would eventually carry the roof planking and the weight of the backfilled earth above. Ragna watched from the edge of the cut and took notes. She drew each joint. She measured each post spacing, approximately 6 feet center to center. She recorded the relationship between post diameter, footing size, and cap beam thickness until the proportions lived in her hands as well as her notebook. "Why field stone footings?" she asked. "Wood on soil rots from the bottom," Pater said. "Stone on soil does not. The stone spreads the weight wider than the post. Wider weight sinks slower." "How wide?" "Twice the post diameter at minimum. 3 times if the soil is soft." Ragna wrote it down. Pater watched her write and said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way she would later recognize as approval. Week 6, October. 14 structural frames raised in the open cut. The storage wing was taking shape. A long rectangular trench with post and cap frames standing at 6-foot intervals like the ribs of a ship turned upside down. The roof planking had begun on the south end, where 3-inch cottonwood planks laid across the cap beams created a surface strong enough to walk on. Ragna recorded the numbers each evening. Frames completed, 14 of 21. Roof sections planked, 4 of 9. Drain channel, 60% lined with stone. Ventilation shafts, 1 of 3 installed. Wood moved underground, 0 cords. Loading would wait until the wing was sealed. Days remaining to November deadline, 26. Debt payment due, 43 days. Cash remaining, $11.30, after purchasing nails and a replacement stoveplate gasket. The math was closing around her like the walls of the trench. Then the rain came. 3 days of steady October rain, not a downpour, but the relentless soaking rain that turns hard ground into paste and flowing soil into moving weight. On the second morning, Ragna heard a sound from the north end of the cut, a low, wet groan followed by a sliding hiss. She reached the trench edge in time to watch the unshored northwest corner collapse inward. The wall simply sat down. 2 feet of soil slumped into the cut, carrying a temporary brace and burying the base of the nearest unfinished frame. The frame tilted. The cap beam slid off its post and dropped into the mud. 6 days of labor, gone in 12 seconds. Ragna stood in the rain and looked at the damage. Peter appeared beside her, breathing hard from the walk across the slope. He said nothing for a full minute. Then he said the only useful thing. It was not shored. I was going to shore it tomorrow. The rain did not know that. They spent the next 4 days clearing the collapsed section, resetting the frame, and installing the bracing that should have been there before the wall exceeded 3 feet. 4 days Ragna did not have. 4 days that pushed the project into the margin between possible and impossible. She sat at the table that night and recalculated. 22 days to the November deadline, 7 frames unfinished, 5 roof sections unplanked, the drain channel incomplete, the ventilation system partially installed, the connecting passage to the kitchen chamber not yet started. 0 cords moved underground. Peter came for supper. He ate in silence while Eli and Odd watched him with the cautious fascination children reserve for adults who enter their world without explanation. When the children were asleep, Ragna showed him the numbers. "It cannot be done," she said. Peter looked at the notebook. Not alone. The next morning, Peter's knee locked. He woke in the small shelter he had built beside the cut, a lean-to of salvaged boards that kept the rain off but not the cold, and his right leg would not bend. The joint had swollen during the night, and the effort of straightening and rebending it through weeks of supervising from the trench edge had finally exceeded what the damaged cartilage would tolerate. He could walk, slowly, with a stick. He could not crouch, kneel, or descend the ladder into the trench. Ragna helped him to the cabin. She heated water and wrapped the knee in warm cloth, and while she worked, Peter spoke for the first time about the injury. The embankment collapse in 1879, the grading crew that had been cutting a railway bed through soft loam above a creek. Someone had removed the downhill brace to speed the excavation. The wall released, and the slide carried Peter 20 feet into the drainage ditch. 2 other men went with him. 1 walked out. 1 was buried to the waist and pulled free with a dislocated shoulder. Peter's knee was bent sideways under the weight of the slide, and the joint had never been right since. He told the story without self-pity, as if describing weather that had happened to someone else. But Ragna heard the lesson inside the story, the same lesson he had been teaching her since the first day. "Someone removed the brace," she said. "Someone was in a hurry." She went to the trench alone that morning and set the next frame herself. The posts were heavy, 8-inch peeled cottonwood, each one 70 or 80 pounds. And lifting them into the trench, positioning them on the fieldstone footings, and holding them vertical while she wedged the cap beam into place required a sequence of rope work, blocking, and leverage that Peter had demonstrated once, and she now performed from memory. The first post took 2 hours. The second took 90 minutes. The third took an hour. By the end of the day, she had completed 1 frame. She needed 6 more. Voss purchased the remaining local supply of planking on the 19th of October. Ragna learned this when she sent Eli to the store with cash for 12 board feet of 3-inch cottonwood plank, the minimum needed to finish the last 2 roof sections. Eli returned with the money and a message. "Mr. Voss regrets that the item is temporarily unavailable." Temporarily unavailable meant Voss had bought it. Every board in the store, every board in the small lumber yard behind the store, every board that the nearest sawmill had ready for sale. He had purchased all of it at wholesale price and locked it in his warehouse. The wood existed. The planks were cut and stacked. They were simply no longer for sale to Ragna. Peter, sitting outside the cabin with his knee wrapped and his jaw tight, said one word: clever. It was not a compliment. It was an assessment. Voss understood that the vault's completion depended on roof planking, and he had removed it from the market the way a chess player removes a piece. Not because he needed it, but because his opponent did. Ragna went to bed that night without writing in the notebook. There was nothing to write. 2 roof sections open to the sky. No planks available. $20 in cash, and even if planks existed for sale, the cost of purchasing them from Voss at whatever markup he chose would consume the money she needed for the debt payment. The project was 17 days from the deadline and 2 roof sections from completion, and the gap between those numbers and the available materials was the exact distance between keeping her family and losing everything. Clara Hume arrived on the 21st of October with a wagon load of dismantled flooring from an abandoned claim shanty 4 miles east. She did not knock. She backed the wagon up to the trench edge and began unloading boards. Some were warped, some had nail holes, some were only 2 inches thick instead of 3. But they were wood, they were dry, and they were the right length. Ragna came out of the cabin and stood beside the wagon. "I thought you said I needed a roof over the pile, not a mine beneath my bed." Clara handed her a board. "I said that before I watched the test base stay dry through 4 rainstorms." She passed another board. "I also said it before Voss bought every plank in the county to stop you from finishing." "This is not charity? This is an investment." Clara pulled a folded paper from her apron. "I want it in writing. 2 cords delivered after winter, valued at full season price, in exchange for materials and 4 days of labor." Ragna took the paper, read it, and signed it against the wagon rail. By noon, 4 women from neighboring claims had arrived. They came not because Clara had asked, but because Clara's wagon had been visible on the road, and curiosity on the prairie was stronger than skepticism. They found work. 2 stripped nails from salvaged boards and straightened them on a stone. 1 stacked wood billets that Ragna had pre-sorted for loading. 1 cooked supper for 9 people using Ragna's supplies and her own contributions. Clara and another woman operated the horse scraper that cleared the last section of the exterior cut. The work bee lasted 3 days. In that time, the final 2 roof sections were planked with Clara's salvaged flooring. The planks were thinner than Peter's specification, so they doubled them. 2 layers with the joints staggered so that no gap aligned through both layers. Peter, supervising from a chair at the trench edge, approved the modification with a nod that contained more respect than most men's speeches. The connecting passage to the kitchen chamber was cut, shored, and framed. The masonry separation wall, field stone laid dry with clay packing, rose between the storage wing and the living space. The double-board hatch, felted with wool around its rim, was fitted into the kitchen floor. When Ragna closed it and stood on it, the seal held her weight without flexing. On the last day of the work bee, they opened the summer loading door and began moving wood. It went slowly. Each billet had to be carried from the outdoor stack, passed into the loading passage, and placed on the raised sleeper racks 8 inches above the vault floor. Ragna assigned bays. She numbered them with chalk on the nearest post. She recorded each removal from the outdoor pile and each placement underground in the ledger. By the evening of October 24th, 8 cords were in the vault. 22 remained outside. Clara looked at the remaining pile in the calendar. 8 days, she said. 7, Ragna corrected. The summer door seals on the 31st. You cannot move 22 cords in 7 days. I can move 3 a day. 3 a day is 21. You need 22. Ragna looked at her. Then I will move 4 on the last day. They moved wood for 7 days. Ragna, Eli, Peter directing from inside the vault, Odd carrying kindling in bundles tied with twine, and Clara for 3 of the 7 days. On days Clara was absent, Ragna worked from first light until the children's voices became too tired to continue, and then she worked alone by lantern light in the vault while the children slept above her. The physical cost was visible. Her shoulders developed a forward curve from carrying billets at waist height through the low-ceilinged loading passage. The infected palm wound reopened, and she wrapped it again without stopping. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. Her clothes hung from her frame, and her cheekbones sharpened in a way that made Peter look at her plate during supper, and then look away. October 29th. The last billet entered Bay 15, 30 cords underground. Ragna closed the summer loading door and sealed it with clay and straw packing. She replaced the sod over the last roof section. She stepped back and looked at the claim. The vault was invisible. The terrace slope looked almost as it had before the excavation began. A gentle rise covered in browned autumn grass, with the cabin sitting at its base as if nothing beneath the surface had changed. The only visible evidence was the kitchen hatch inside the cabin and 2 wooden ventilation caps protruding 6 inches above the sod line. Peter stood beside her. His knee was better. The forced rest during the work bee had reduced the swelling, and he leaned on his stick with the expression of a man looking at something he had helped build but did not entirely trust. "The earth will test it before we do," he said. Ragna nodded. She went inside, opened the hatch, and climbed down the ladder into the vault. The air was cool and still, and smelled of fresh split wood and stone. The billets stood in their numbered bays, pale faces showing where the splits had exposed clean grain, bark sides facing outward, each row separated from the walls by 4-inch air gaps. The center aisle stretched 32 feet, illuminated by the lantern she carried and by a thread of daylight filtering through the high ventilation shaft at the far end. She tapped a billet. The sound came back sharp and dry. She climbed out, closed the hatch, and stood on it. The children were asleep. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind had shifted to the northwest, and somewhere in the darkness above the terrace, the first ice of the season was forming on the grass. November arrived with the sound of geese. Ragna hung 2 alcohol thermometers the first week, one outside beneath the eave, one in the central aisle of the vault. She recorded both readings each morning and evening in the notebook. On a night when the outside thermometer dropped to 8 degrees above zero, the vault held at 38. The difference, 30 degrees by Paris, was not magic. The earth surrounding the vault conducted heat slowly, and the mass of soil above and beside the chamber acted as a buffer that smoothed the temperature swings of the surface air. The vault would never be warm. It would never reach the freezing point if the outside temperature stayed above 38 below zero for extended periods. It was, as Ragna's father had taught her, slow. The earth slowed the cold. The comparison test was more convincing than the numbers. August Venn had agreed, reluctantly, to Ragna's wager from weeks earlier. 6 marked billets sat in Bay 2 of the vault. 6 identical billets sat in Ven's outdoor stack, tagged with wire. After 30 days, they would compare. At the 3-week mark, a sleet storm passed through the settlement. The outdoor billets darkened, ice coated their exposed faces, and sealed the cracks where seasoning had opened the grain. When Ven struck one with his palm, the ice rang. Ragna brought the corresponding vault billets out through the kitchen hatch. They were pale, dry. When she tapped them against the stove, They rang with the clean, hollow note of well-seasoned wood ready to burn. Clara examined both sets. She held a vault billet in one hand and an outdoor billet in the other. "The weight," she said. The vault billet was lighter, not by much, perhaps a pound in a 12-pound piece, but enough to feel. The outdoor billet had absorbed moisture through its ice coating, and the water weight was trapped in the grain. It would burn, eventually, but it would hiss and steam and waste heat driving water out before it could warm a room. Clara did not call the project proven. "One bay," she said, "one storm, 1 month. That is not winter." She was right. And Ragna knew she was right because knowing the difference between a successful test and a successful season was precisely the kind of distinction that separated survival from luck. But the bay was dry. The wood was light. The thermometer held steady. And the hatch opened from inside the cabin without requiring a single swing of an axe. Ragna never claimed to predict the season. She did not announce that a catastrophic ice storm would strike in December. She did not stand in the store and prophesy doom. She was not a seer. She was a woman who kept a notebook and noticed what other people accepted. Her specific warning came roughly 18 hours before the crisis. The conditions assembled themselves over the first week of December. Several days of hard cold froze the ground to a depth that would not thaw quickly. The Big Sioux drainage ran quiet under shelf ice. Wood piles across the settlement stood firm in the dry cold, accessible, manageable, ordinary. Then the wind shifted. A southeast flow brought moist air across the frozen ground. The temperature rose slowly, not to thawing, but toward it. 30 degrees. 32. The air felt thick after days of dry cold, and the barometer Pater kept, a railway issue aneroid he had carried since his grading days, dropped steadily through the afternoon. Ragna checked the barometer at 4 o'clock. She checked the outdoor thermometer. She walked to the pump and ran her hand along the iron handle. A thin film of ice coated the north side, the side facing the wind. The drops in the air were liquid. They struck the frozen metal and froze on contact. She found Ven at his house, stacking wood beside the kitchen door. "The rain that has come in will freeze," she said. Ven looked at the sky. Gray, low, featureless. It looked like 100 December skies he had seen before. "Rain in December loosens winter," he said. "It does not lock it. The ground is frozen. The iron is frozen. The air is above freezing. When the rain hits the ground, it will not run off. It will coat. We have had freezing drizzle before. This is not drizzle. The pressure is still falling. The wind is pulling moisture from the southeast. When the front passes, the temperature will drop and everything the rain has coated will be sealed." Ven placed another billet on his stack. "I appreciate the warning, Mrs. Brecka. I survived the winter of '81. I will manage a little rain." Ragna went home. She closed the ventilation shutters halfway, enough to maintain airflow, not enough to allow wind-driven moisture to enter. She checked the drain channel exit. Clear. She carried 2 armloads of billets onto the warming rack inside the kitchen, the raised shelf beside the hatch where cabin heat could dry any surface moisture before burning. She placed extra kindling in the box beside the stove. She told Eli to fill every water container in the house. She told Odd to bring the chickens inside the lean-to and latch the door. Then she waited. The rain began at dusk. Soft at first, a whisper against the frozen ground, a tapping on the pump handle, a sound like sand falling on the window glass. Not snow, not sleet, rain, liquid water falling from air that was 33 degrees onto ground that was 26. Within the first hour, the transformation began. The ice arrived the way debts arrive, slowly, then all at once. The first layer was invisible. A glaze thinner than a fingernail coated the pump handle, the wagon's spokes, the fence wires, the exposed faces of every woodpile in the settlement. Ragna ran her thumbnail along the porch rail and felt the surface resist, smooth, hard, bonded to the wood as if it had always been there. The rain continued. The second hour added weight. The glaze thickened on horizontal surfaces first, the tops of fence posts, the upper faces of stacked billets, the wagon beds, the roof edges. Vertical surfaces accumulated more slowly because gravity pulled the water downward before it could freeze, but the wind changed that. The southeast wind drove rain against western-facing surfaces at an angle that gave each drop time to spread and harden before the next drop landed on top of it. By the third hour, branches had begun to snap. Not large branches, the small brittle ones that had died during the autumn, the ones that usually broke in spring windstorms. The ice added weight they were not designed to carry, and they surrendered one at a time with cracking sounds that carried through the wet air like distant gunshots. Families remained calm. Their stoves were burning. The rain felt warmer than the cold that had preceded it, and warmth in December was not something anyone on the Dakota Plains complained about. The ice was a nuisance. It would melt when the rain stopped or when the sun came out. It always did. By the sixth hour, it had not stopped. The wind drove water horizontally into the outdoor woodpiles. Gravity pulled liquid toward lower surfaces before it froze, creating uneven formations. Fins, ridges, and fused contact points between billets, rather than the smooth cylindrical coating that people imagined when they thought about ice on wood. The ice was not uniform. It was architectural. It built itself according to the physics of wind direction, surface texture, and the temperature differential between air and object, and the structures it created were stronger than any uniform layer because they locked the billets to one another with bridges and buttresses of solid ice. August Venn went to his woodpile at the 9th hour. He swung his axe at the top course. The axe bounced, not off wood, off ice. The glaze on the upper billets had reached half an inch, and the wind-driven accretion on the western face was already approaching an inch in places. The billets were fused to one another at every contact point. Pulling one free required breaking not just the surface ice, but every bridge between it and the adjacent pieces. Venn struck again. A chip of ice flew. The billet beneath did not move. He repositioned and struck from a different angle, trying to wedge the blade between two billets. The ice cracked at the point of impact, but did not separate. He struck again. The wooden handle, cold contracted stress by the impact, split along the grain. He went inside and started burning furniture legs. Across the settlement, the same discovery repeated itself in variations. Men struck their piles with axes, mauls, hammers, and pry bars. Some freed individual billets from the upper courses where the ice was thinnest. Those billets were wet, soaked from the rain that had coated them, and they hissed and steamed on stove plates that needed heat, not moisture. The heat the wood eventually produced was spent first on driving out the water it had absorbed, leaving less energy for the room. Other men could not free even the upper course. Their piles were oriented with the broad face toward the prevailing wind, and the wind-driven accretion had created a continuous sheet across the entire exposed surface. An axe could chip a hole. It could not open a hole wide enough to extract a 4-foot billet without an hour of sustained chopping, and the temperature was dropping. By the 12th hour, the wind had shifted northwest. The rain changed briefly to sleet, hard pellets that rattled against the ice-coated surfaces and filled every crack and gap the rain had left unfrozen. Then the sleet stopped, and the clouds thinned, and the sky behind them was the color of iron. The temperature fell, 20 degrees. Families pulled blankets from beds and hung them over windows. 15. Drafts that had been minor annoyances became visible. breath condensed in the air and traced the paths of cold air entering through gaps in the siding. 8 degrees. The water bucket beside the stove developed a skin of ice around its edges. 4 degrees. Stove plates that had been warm to the touch became the only warm surfaces in the room. 0, 10 below, 20 below, 24 below by dawn. And on the exposed ground beyond the settlement, where the wind scraped across the frozen terrain without obstruction, a dramatized low near 38 below. Cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, cold enough to kill a healthy man between his barn and his front door if he fell and could not rise. The composite shell reached 3 to 4 inches on the windward faces. It was not pure glaze, the neat, transparent ice of a single freezing event. It was a fused mass of glaze from the initial rain, wind-driven accretion from the horizontal spray, packed sleet from the transition period, and refrozen snowmelt that had run down the stacked surfaces during the brief warming and solidified when the temperature plunged. The layers had bonded to one another and to the wood beneath them with the molecular stubbornness of water that had been given enough surface area and enough time to lock itself into place. Men hit it with everything they had. An iron maul head loosened on its handle after 6 blows. The cold had contracted the wood shaft faster than the iron, and the wedge popped free. 2 wooden axe handles split on impact. A farmer named Dietrich brought a steel pry bar and managed to separate 3 billets from the upper course of his pile before the bar slipped on the ice surface and struck his shin hard enough to drop him. The billets Dietrich freed were wet to the core. He carried them inside and placed them on the stove plate. They hissed, they steamed. The moisture bleeding from the grain hit the hot iron and filled the kitchen with the smell of wet wood and the sound of water being tortured into vapor. The room temperature dropped as the stove's heat was consumed by the conversion of liquid water to steam rather than the warming of air. His wife fed the stove with the wooden seat of a chair. Orrin Voss tried a different approach. He poured kerosene onto an opening he had chopped in his commercial fuel yard, a large outdoor lot where he stored purchased wood for winter resale. The kerosene ignited on the ice surface and burned with a yellow flame that melted a shallow depression. The meltwater ran down between the billets, reached colder surfaces below, and froze again. The fire consumed the kerosene without reaching the wood. Voss poured more. The same result: melt, run, refreeze. He was spending fuel to create ice. He stopped and looked at the pile. His breath clouded and froze on his beard. The commercial lot held 60 cords, and he could not reach a single one. Ragna opened the kitchen hatch at dawn on the second day. She did not announce it. She did not send word. She knelt on the kitchen floor, lifted the double-board hatch by its rope handle, and felt the change before she saw it. The air that rose through the opening was cool, upper 30s, perhaps 40 degrees, but dry. No moisture, no ice smell, no frozen surfaces. The ladder rungs were bare wood. The lantern she lowered on a rope illuminated the central aisle, and the billets stood exactly as she had placed them in October. Pale, dry, separated by air gaps, resting on raised racks above a floor that showed no standing water. She climbed down. The vault was quiet in a way the world above it had forgotten. No wind, no cracking branches, no desperate axe blows. The sounds of the catastrophe did not penetrate the earth. The stone walls, the packed soil above the roof planking, the mass of the terrace slope. All of it absorbed sound the way it absorbed temperature change, slowly, incompletely, but enough to create a space that felt like a different season. She selected a billet from Bay 3. She tapped it against the wall. The ring was clean and high, the note of wood that had been seasoned for months and stored in stable air, wood that contained less moisture than the day it was stacked. She carried it up the ladder, placed it on the warming rack for 10 minutes to bring it closer to room temperature, and then set it on the stove. It caught without hissing. The flame traveled along the pale grain, found the seasoned fibers, and produced the steady heat that burning wood is supposed to produce, and that every other household in the settlement had lost access to. Ragna set a second billet on the warming rack. She closed the hatch. She looked at the stove, where the flame was building the kind of heat that would warm the cabin to livable temperature within the hour. This was the private proof, the proof that the vault worked, that the principle was sound, that her father's lesson and Pater's engineering and her own relentless calculations had produced the result she had predicted. But the private proof was not enough, because 3 miles east, Clara Hume's youngest daughter was coughing in a cabin that was running out of heat. The message arrived through Eli, not a written message, a visual one. Eli had climbed to the sleeping loft and pressed her face against the frost-glazed window. Through the ice, she could see the Hume property, and what she saw was smoke, not chimney smoke, the wrong color, the wrong place. A thin gray thread rising from the ground beside Clara's cabin, where someone had attempted an open fire near the woodpile. The fire was dying. In 38 below air, an open flame against ice-encased wood was not a fire. It was a gesture. "Mama! Mrs. Hume's smoke is on the ground!" Ragna went to the window. She looked. Then she went to the kitchen and began loading billets onto the warming rack. Not 2, but 12, enough to fill the small sled. Pater appeared at the cabin door. He had spent the night in the lean-to beside the vault. Warmer than his own shelter because the earth above the storage wing released stored heat slowly through the sod ochre, and his face was gray with cold and stiffness. "Clara's fire's out," Ragna said. "The roads are ice. Her daughter Ruth is sick, chest infection. 2 weeks now." Pater said nothing. He knew, as Ragna knew, what happened to a sick child in an unheated cabin at 38 below zero. The body's heat production fell as illness progressed. The extremities cooled first. The core followed. In a warm room, the child fought the infection. In a cold room, the infection won because the body could not maintain both temperature and immune response simultaneously. "I will go," Ragna said. "You cannot walk 3 miles on ice." "I will follow the fence line. The posts give handholds." She loaded the sled, 12 billets wrapped in a quilt to prevent them from cooling too quickly in transit. She tied a rope to the sled runners and looped the other end around her waist. She put on every layer she owned, 2 dresses, a wool coat, a shawl wrapped twice around her head, and the remaining pair of boots with rags stuffed into the toes for insulation. She opened the door. The world outside was glass. Every surface reflected the flat gray sky. The ground, the fence posts, the wagon, the pump handle, the woodpile, all of it encased and shining and absolutely still. The silence was the most unnatural part. No wind, no dripping, no animal sounds. The cold had killed the motion out of everything, and what remained was a landscape that looked preserved rather than alive. She took 1 step. Her boot slid. She caught the door frame. She took another step, shorter, testing, and felt the ice hold beneath the sole with the reluctant grip of a surface that would release her if she asked for too much. She reached the first fence post and wrapped one hand around it. The ice on the wood burned through her mitten, and she pulled the mitten higher and gripped again. 1 post at a time, 12 feet between posts. The Hume property was 3 miles. That was roughly 1,300 fence posts. She began walking. Halfway to the Hume property, she saw Clara. Clara was coming toward her on the road, pulling a smaller sled with Ruth wrapped in every blanket the Hume cabin contained. Ruth's face was visible, a small pale circle above the quilts, and her eyes were closed. Not sleeping. The stillness was wrong. Children who sleep move. Ruth was not moving. Clara's lips were cracked and bleeding from the cold. She had been walking for an hour. She had not followed the fence line. She had taken the road because it was shorter, and the road was a sheet of ice that had overturned the sled twice. She was limping. One knee of her dress was torn and dark with blood where she had fallen. Behind Clara, moving carefully from post to post the way Ragna had been moving, was August Venn. He had seen Clara pass his property and followed. He was 61 years old and walking on ice with a shoulder that was not yet injured, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who understood that the situation had passed the point where competence mattered. Only proximity to warmth mattered now. They converged in the road. 3 adults, 2 sleds, 1 child who had stopped shivering. And the absence of shivering was worse than its presence because shivering meant the body was fighting and stillness meant the body was conceding. "My cabin," Ragna said. "The stove is burning. I have wood." They turned back. Ragna led. Clara pulled Ruth's sled. Venn walked behind, guarding against a fall on the ice with the grim attentiveness of a man who knew exactly what a broken hip meant at 38 below zero. 200 yards from Ragna's property, Venn's boot hit a ridge of ice that the rain had formed along a frozen wagon rut. His feet went out from under him. He landed on his right shoulder with a sound that Ragna heard 20 feet ahead. A thick, wet impact followed by a shout that he cut short between his teeth. She went back. Venn was on the ground, his face white, his right arm held against his chest. The shoulder had taken the full force of the fall against frozen ground, and when he tried to raise the arm, the pain stopped him at chest height. "Separated," he said through his teeth. "Maybe broken. Can you walk?" "I can walk." He walked. They reached the cabin. Ragna opened the door, and the heat met them like a wall. 62 degrees inside, a temperature that felt tropical after the air they had been breathing. Clara carried Ruth to the stove and unwrapped her. The child's lips were pale, not blue, but the color was wrong, washed out, as if the blood had retreated from every surface to protect the organs beneath. Ragna opened the hatch. She brought up 4 more billets and loaded the stove until the iron glowed red along the seams. The room climbed, 65, 68, 70. Ruth began shivering. Clara made a sound that was not a word. She pressed her face against Ruth's hair and held her, and the shivering continued. Violent, racking tremors that shook the quilts and made the sled frame rattle against the floor. But the tremors meant the body was fighting again. The body had found warmth and was demanding more of it, and the stove was answering. Venn sat against the wall with his arm in a sling Ragna had made from a flour sack. He watched the fire. He watched the billets burn clean and hot without a whisper of steam. He looked at the hatch in the floor and at the dry air rising through it, and the understanding crossed his face in stages. First recognition, then calculation, then the specific silence of a man revising everything he thought he knew. He did not speak, not yet. The time for speaking would come later, when the crisis receded and language was adequate again. For now he watched the fire and held his arm and listened to Ruth shiver, and the sound of a child returning to life in a heated room was the only validation that mattered. But the crisis had not finished. If you are invested in this story, subscribe and stay with us. Because Ragna now has enough wood, but not enough time to reach everyone. 48 people across the settlement needed heat. Ragna's vault held 30 cords. enough fuel for weeks if managed correctly. But the fuel was in one location, accessible through one hatch, and the people who needed it were scattered across claims connected by roads that no wagon, horse, or sled could travel safely. Ragna proposed consolidation. She stood in her kitchen with Clara, Ven, and Peter, who had been inside the vault organizing the loading sequence since the first billets were removed, and laid out the arithmetic. 4 buildings could serve as warming stations. Her cabin, which was small but had the hatch, the schoolhouse, which had the largest stove and the most floor space, Clara's kitchen, which was big enough for 2 families, and Ven's store, whose brick chimney was the safest structure in the settlement for continuous firing. Fuel allowance, approximately half a cord per building each day for heating, cooking, and warming water. Additional kindling and smaller stock for starting and maintaining fires. Total daily consumption, 2.5 to 3 cords if waste was controlled. Available reserve, 30 cords minus the 2 already consumed, 28 cords. Crisis endurance at 3 cords per day, roughly 9 days. At 2.5, 11. The temperature outside was 32 below and falling. People will not leave their homes, Clara said. Empty buildings can freeze, Ragna answered. People cannot. The livestock that can be moved will be sheltered. The livestock that cannot be moved may die. If people stay in unheated buildings with their animals, the people will die, and the animals will die. Ven spoke for the first time since the injury. His voice was tight with pain. She is right. I watched 2 families try to outlast the hard winter in '81. They burned everything in the house and then started on the walls. By the time we reached them, the children had frostbite on their feet because the floor was gone. The decision was not unanimous. It was not even discussed in the usual sense. Ragna stated the math. Ven confirmed the precedent. Clara agreed to open her kitchen. Peter described the loading sequence that would keep the vault stable as billets were removed. They sent word through the fence line network. Messages passed between properties by people walking hand over hand along wire and wooden posts. Come to the 4 stations. Bring blankets, food, and water containers. Leave livestock sheltered with whatever fodder was accessible. Come now. The human chain formed by afternoon. Peter worked inside the vault, moving along the central aisle with the lantern, selecting billets from alternating bays. He never emptied a single bay completely. Instead, he took 2 or 3 from each position, preserving the cross-stacked end columns that kept each row stable. Ragna had placed those end columns deliberately during the loading, interlocked billets at 90-degree angles that acted as bookends for each row, removed them, and the row could collapse into the aisle and block the passage. Peter understood this without being told. The lesson he had taught Ragna, never remove support in an uncontrolled sequence, applied as much to the wood inside the vault as to the soil outside it. Ragna stood at the hatch and received billets as Peter passed them up. She recorded each removal in the ledger: bay number, quantity, time. The record was not bureaucracy, it was survival planning. If she knew exactly how much remained in each bay, she could calculate how many days the reserve would last at current consumption and adjust the allocation before a shortage became a crisis. Eli stood in the kitchen and passed kindling to Clara, who bundled it with rope for the sled teams. Odd helped by stacking the bundled wood beside the door in the order it would be loaded. He was 5 years old and serious in the way that children become serious when they understand that the adults around them are afraid. Ven directed the rope routes between buildings. His right arm hung useless in the sling, but his left hand held the rope and his voice carried, and the route he mapped, cabin to schoolhouse to store to Clara's kitchen and back, followed fence lines and windbreaks that provided handholds every 12 feet. The first sled of dry wood reached the schoolhouse at 3 o'clock on the second afternoon. The schoolhouse stove had been cold for 6 hours. The teacher, a man named Erickson, had burned his desk, 2 benches, and a stack of primers before the fuel ran out. 11 children from 3 families sat on the floor wrapped in coats and blankets, and the temperature inside the building was 19 degrees, cold enough that breath froze on the wool scarves over their faces. Erickson opened the stove door. He placed the first billet, dry, pale, light in his hands, on the cold grate. He struck a match. The billet caught, not slowly, not reluctantly, not with the hissing protest of wet wood. It caught the way seasoned dry wood catches, flame traveling along the grain, heat blooming outward, the stove metal expanding with a series of quiet ticks as the iron warmed. The children moved closer. The frost on the inside of the window nearest the stove began to soften at the edges. By the third day, the system was operating. 4 buildings. 43 people consolidated, with 5 others who refused to leave their claims and received daily fuel deliveries by sled. 3 cords consumed per day, 22 cords remaining. On the third night, the northern ventilation cap on the vault froze shut. Ragna noticed because the air quality in the vault changed. Peter felt it first, a heaviness, a dampness that had not been there an hour before. Condensation appeared on the underside of the roof planks, beating on the wood and dripping onto the billets below. The repeated opening of the hatch, dozens of times per day as billets were removed, was introducing warm cabin air into the vault. That warm air carried moisture. With both exhaust vents open, the moisture rose through the high shafts and exited. With one shaft frozen, the air had nowhere to go. It condensed on the coldest available surface, which was the roof planking closest to the frozen vent. If the condensation continued, the billets beneath the drip line would absorb water. In a week, they would burn the way the outdoor wood burned, reluctantly, wastefully, with heat lost to evaporation. Ragna climbed out of the vault. She went outside. The terrace slope above the vault was a sheet of ice. The ventilation caps were barely visible, wooden boxes protruding 6 inches above the sod, each capped with a hinged lid that allowed air to exit while preventing rain and snow from entering. The northern cap was sealed. Ice had coated the lid and frozen the hinge, and the warm, moist air rising from inside had frozen on the underside of the lid in a thick mass that blocked the opening completely. She could not reach it from the ground. The slope was too steep and too icy to climb without a rope. She tied a line to the chimney base, the one solid anchor point on the cabin roof. She wrapped the rope around her waist and crawled up the icy slope on her hands and knees, feeling for the sod surface beneath the glaze, testing each handhold before committing her weight. The northern vent cap was 12 feet from the chimney. She reached it in the dark. The lantern was useless in the wind, so she navigated by feel, her hands reading the slope the way Peter read the soil. She found the wooden box. She felt the ice. She struck the lid with the heel of her palm. Nothing. She struck again with a stone she had carried in her coat pocket. The hinge cracked. The lid swung up. Warm, moist air rushed past her face and froze instantly in the outside air, coating her hair and collar with a rind of ice that crackled when she moved. She closed her eyes and felt the warmth on her face. The breath of the vault rising through the shaft, carrying the heat of buried wood and stored energy and everything she had built to protect what winter wanted to destroy. Then she crawled back to the chimney, descended the rope, and went inside. Peter was waiting at the base of the ladder. He had heard the hinge crack from inside the vault and had inspected the underside of the cap. "It will freeze again," he said. "I will clear it again." "Every night?" "Every night until the cold breaks." But Peter had noticed something else. During the condensation, a roof plank in the third bay had developed a crack. The plank was one of Clara's salvaged boards, thinner than the original specification, doubled for strength but weakened at a knothole that had not been visible during installation. The weight of the backfilled earth pressed down. The moisture softened the fibers around the knot. The crack spread slowly, and Pater heard it the way a carpenter hears flaws. A faint popping in the grain that the untrained ear would dismiss as settling. He ordered everyone out of the aisle. He braced the cracked plank with a spare post, a length of cottonwood he had kept inside the vault for exactly this kind of emergency, wedging it between the floor and the underside of the weakened board with enough pressure to relieve the load. The plank held. The vault held. But the warning was real. The design was not invulnerable. 30 cords of wood in an earthen vault, with a kitchen hatch and a woman who crawled across ice to clear a frozen vent. This was not a permanent solution. This was a system operating at its limits, maintained by attention and effort, and the refusal to sleep while the temperature outside tried to find a way through every weakness the construction had left unsealed. After 5 days, the cold broke. The temperature rose through 0, then 10, then 20. The ice did not melt. It was too thick, too fused, too massive to disappear in a single thaw. But the grip loosened. Axes that had bounced off frozen wood piles 3 days earlier now bit into surface ice that cracked and separated. Men freed the upper courses first, then worked downward, each billet requiring less effort than the one above it. Ragna's ledger recorded the final numbers. 11 3/4 cords consumed from the vault, 18 1/4 cords remaining, dry and sound. 4 communal buildings heated continuously for 5 days, 48 people sheltered. Ruth Hume alive, still coughing, but alive. August Venn's shoulder badly bruised, not broken, range of motion returning. No resident frozen to death. 7 head of livestock lost in unheated outbuildings across the settlement. Nearly every exposed woodpile in the district, still partly inaccessible, with inner courses wet and outer courses fused. Ragna closed the hatch. She sat at the table. The notebook lay open to the consumption page, 11 3/4 cords in 5 days, neatly recorded by bay number and date. The numbers were ordinary. They were the most extraordinary ordinary numbers she had ever written. Outside, the woodpiles glittered in the returning sun. Axe marks scarred the ice where desperate men had tried to reach fuel that was buried under its own protection. The marks looked like wounds, shallow, irregular, unsuccessful. Below the cabin floor, 18 1/4 cords of wood stood in the dark, pale, dry, waiting. And 3 miles away, in his store with the brick chimney, Orrin Voss was looking at his 60-cord commercial lot and realizing that the woman he had tried to bankrupt now held the only accessible fuel reserve in the settlement. And the debt note in his pocket was worth exactly as much as she decided it was worth. The settlement returned to its separate buildings slowly, the way water finds its level after a flood. Not all at once, but in stages. Each family testing the thaw before committing to the walk home. Clara took Ruth back on the 3rd day after the cold broke, when the road surface had softened enough to hold a boot without sliding. Venn left the same morning, his arms still in the sling, his face carrying the particular tiredness of a man who has spent 5 days sitting in someone else's house, knowing he would have died in his own. Ragna did not rest. She descended into the vault the morning after the last family left, carrying the lantern and the notebook, and she walked the central aisle bay by bay, recording what remained. The validation came in layers, each one harder to dismiss than the last. The first layer was private. Ragna's ledger showed the arithmetic. 11 3/4 cords removed over 5 days. distributed to 4 buildings, consumed at an average rate of 2 and 1/3 cords per day. The rate was lower than her initial estimate because Peter had insisted on smaller, hotter fires rather than large ones. Seasoned wood burned efficiently at a controlled draft, and efficiency meant fewer billets per hour of warmth. The ledger entries were nothing more than numbers in a ruled notebook, but each number represented a room that stayed warm, a stove that stayed lit, a child who did not freeze. The second layer was physical. Clara brought the marked test billets to Ragna's cabin on the 8th day after the crisis. She had kept one set in her kitchen, a vault billet and an outdoor billet, side by side on a shelf where she could observe them as the thaw progressed. The vault billet was unchanged, pale grain, clean split face, light in the hand. The outdoor billet had been freed from the ice on the 4th day. The surface was dark, not from rot, not yet, but from water that had penetrated the grain under the ice coating and remained trapped as the temperature plunged. Clara split the billet with a hand axe. The interior was wet, not damp, wet. Dark streaks followed the grain where moisture had been pulled inward by capillary pressure, and when she held the split face near the stove, water beaded on the surface before it could evaporate. The weight, Clara said again, the way she had said it during the pre-storm comparison. But this time the word carried a different meaning. Before, the weight difference had been subtle, a pound in 12. Now it was obvious. The outdoor billet felt like river stone compared to the vault billet. The water content was the difference between fuel and dead weight. Clara set both halves on the table. "I told you one bay and one storm was not winter," she said. "This was winter." She did not say the vault was proven. She did not need to. The third layer was public, and it required August Venn. 10 days after the crisis, Venn called a gathering at his store. The invitation was informal. Word passed along the fence lines, carried by children and neighbors stopping at the well, but the attendance was not. 31 adults came. They stood in the store's main room with their coats on and their hats in their hands, because the store was still cold and the brick chimney that had kept it livable during the crisis was down to a maintenance fire. Venn stood beside the counter. His right arm remained in the sling. His face had the color of a man who had not slept well in 2 weeks, and the lines around his eyes had deepened into channels that had not been there in October. He spoke without preamble. "I told Mrs. Brecky that rain in December loosens winter." He paused. "I said it in this store. Some of you heard me say it. Voss repeated it. We all believed it because we had always believed it, and because believing it was easier than considering what would happen if we were wrong." He looked toward the window, where the light came through glass that still bore the ghost of interior frost. "I mistook habit for knowledge." The room was silent. Venn was not a man who admitted error easily, and the silence held the weight of 31 people recognizing that the admission cost him something he would not recover. "Mrs. Brecka did not predict the future," he continued. "She identified a vulnerability. Every one of us stores fuel in the open. Every one of us assumed that what we stacked in September would be reachable in January. She asked why we assumed that, and none of us had an answer because none of us had asked the question." He turned to Ragna, who was standing near the back with Eli beside her. "The wood in your vault kept my arm from becoming the least of my problems. I would like to understand how it works." The question was an invitation, and Ragna recognized it as such. Venn was not asking because he did not understand the principle. He was asking publicly, in front of 31 people, so that the answer would be heard by everyone and the hearing would be legitimate. A question from August Venn was an endorsement. A public question was a transfer of authority. Ragna described the vault in terms that the room could follow. She did not lecture. She spoke the way Peter had taught her, through specifics. The outside thermometer read 8 degrees the night before the storm. The vault thermometer read 38. That difference exists because Earth changes temperature slowly. The soil above the vault absorbs heat in summer and releases it in winter, but the release takes weeks and months, not hours. The vault never warms above 45. It never drops below freezing unless the outside air stays below 38 below for an extended period. She held up the 2 comparison billets, the marked pieces from the original wager. The vault billet weighs 11 pounds. The outdoor billet weighs 14.5. The difference is water. Water that entered through the ice coating, through the sleet, through the rain that froze on contact. The outdoor billet will burn. It will also hiss for 20 minutes before it produces useful heat. The vault billet burns clean immediately. She set the billets on the counter. But the vault did not succeed because of temperature. It succeeded because the entrance was inside my kitchen. The ice sealed every outdoor surface in the settlement. It sealed doors, hatches, shed entrances, and woodpile faces. It did not seal my kitchen floor. The room shifted. Ragna could feel the shift, the quiet recalculation that happens when people understand that the critical insight is simpler than they expected. The vault was not a miracle of engineering. It was a door that could not freeze shut. The quantified comparison spread through the settlement over the following days as families examined their own storage. Outdoor piles, the standard method used by every household, had fared the worst. Outer courses remained fused on north and west faces, even 10 days after the thaw began. Inner billets were wet from moisture that had penetrated through the ice and been trapped when the temperature dropped. The best maintained stacks, those with tight cross-stacking and good drainage beneath the rails, had lost roughly the outer 2 courses to ice damage. The worst had lost half their accessible volume. Ordinary roofed stacks, the lean-to shelters that a handful of families maintained, performed better than open piles but worse than expected. The roofs stopped vertical rain. They did not stop horizontal wind-driven water, which had entered from the sides and coated the billets nearest the open faces. More critically, the entrances had iced shut. A lean-to with a frozen door was a box of fuel no one could reach. The vault had lost nothing to ice damage. Its entrance remained accessible throughout the crisis. Its internal temperature had not crossed the freezing point. Its drain had continued to function because the drain exit was on the south face of the terrace, sheltered from the prevailing wind and warmed slightly by reflected heat from the cabin's stone foundation. The lesson Ragna drew was not that every family needed an underground vault. It was that every family needed to answer 3 questions about their fuel storage. Could they reach it when the entrance was sealed? Could they burn it when the wood was wet? Could they survive long enough to wait for a thaw if the answer to either question was no? The answer for most families was no to all 3. Voss arrived 11 days after the crisis with the debt note and a pen. He came to Ragna's cabin at mid-morning, wearing his town coat and carrying the leather case. His manner had changed since the emergency, not softened exactly, but sharpened in a new direction. He had spent 5 days in his store watching the brick chimney consume furniture, packing crates, and wooden display fixtures because his 60-cord commercial lot was encased in ice. He had watched Ragna's dry billets arrive by sled and burn clean on the schoolhouse stove. He had watched his own kerosene pour onto ice and refreeze. And he had calculated, as he calculated everything, the new balance of power. The debt note was real, $46.80, due November 15th. November 15th had passed during the construction, and Ragna had not paid. Voss had not pressed the issue during the crisis because pressing it would have required seizing wood that was keeping 48 people alive, and even Orrin Voss understood that particular line. But the crisis was over. The note was overdue. And the 18 remaining cords in the vault represented the most valuable fuel reserve in the settlement, dry, accessible, proven. Voss sat at the table. 18 cords, he said. At winter crisis price, that is worth $144. At pre-storm rate, $90. At the rate your contract specified, $72. I am aware of the numbers. You owe me $46.80. I am prepared to accept 18 cords at a discounted rate sufficient to clear the note. At what rate? $2.60 per cord. Ragna did not move. $2.60 per cord was below cost, below the labor value, below the cutting and splitting price, below the hauling and storage expense. Voss was offering to take the remaining reserve at a rate that would clear his note and leave Ragna with nothing. No wood for her own household, no wood for the contracted deliveries, no income for the spring. No, she said. Voss folded his hands. The note is overdue. My legal position is clear. Your legal position requires a magistrate. The magistrate is in Brookings. The road to Brookings is ice. The road will clear. When it clears, I will have already delivered the contracted wood. She opened the ledger. The pages she showed him were the emergency distribution records. Every billet removed during the crisis, dated, numbered by bay, recorded with the name of the receiving household and the building it heated. During the emergency, I distributed 11 3/4 cords to 4 buildings serving 48 people. The school board, Mr. Venn, Mrs. Hume, and 6 other households received fuel. Each distribution is recorded at the original contract rate, the rate those families agreed to pay for winter delivery, not a crisis surcharge, not a disaster rate, the rate we agreed in September. Voss stared at the ledger. The total value of the distributed wood at contract rates is $47. The school board, Mr. Venn, and the 6 receiving households have signed acknowledgments of their debt to me. Their combined obligation exceeds your note by 20 cents. She slid the acknowledgment papers across the table. 6 sheets, each signed and dated, each specifying the quantity received and the rate owed. Voss picked up the papers. He read them slowly. His jaw tightened in a way that Ragna had seen before, the look of a man whose calculation has been outperformed by someone he assumed could not calculate. You are proposing to pay my note with other people's debts. I am proposing to assign their obligations to you at face value. You collect from them. They pay you what they owe me. The note is cleared. And if they do not pay? They will pay. They are alive because of the wood they received. Alive people pay their debts. Dead people do not. Voss collected the papers. He stood. At the door, he turned. You have made yourself the fuel merchant, Mrs. Brecka. I have made myself the person who kept fuel accessible when the fuel merchant could not reach his own supply. Voss left. The note was not yet formally cleared. He would need to accept the assignment and pursue collection. But the leverage had shifted. Ragna held signed obligations worth more than the debt. Voss held a note against a woman whom the settlement now recognized as the reason they were alive. He could press the note. He could demand seizure. He could pursue legal action in Brookings when the roads cleared. But every step would require explaining to a magistrate why he was pursuing a widow whose stored fuel had saved 48 people, while his commercial lot sat frozen and useless. The math was against him now, and Voss understood math. Peter Kvami began drawing revisions the day after Venn's gathering. He spread paper on Ragna's table, not the notebook paper she used, but large sheets from his railway folio, creased at the folds and yellowed at the edges. He drew with a carpenter's pencil, sharpened to a flat edge, and the lines he produced were precise enough to follow without explanation. Your vault works, he said. It also nearly killed you 3 times. Ragna sat across the table and watched him draw. She did not argue. The vault had succeeded, and the vault had also required her to crawl across an icy slope to clear a frozen vent, had cracked a roof plank under the stress of condensation and load, had demanded round-the-clock monitoring during the crisis, and had been built at a scale that no other family in the settlement could replicate without the same months of labor, the same mentor, and the same stubbornness. One vault for one family is a miracle, Pater said. Miracles do not scale. His revised drawings showed smaller structures, 4-cord and 8-cord caches, hillside excavations that a family could build cooperatively in 2 weeks rather than 2 months. Each cache followed the same principles: subsurface construction, interior access, ventilation, drainage. But the scale was different. A 4-cord cache required a room 12 feet by 8 feet by 6 feet. It needed 4 post and cap frames instead of 21. It needed 1 drain channel instead of 3. It could be built into any slope that offered 4 feet of cover, and a slope like that existed on nearly every claim in the river drainage. They argued about the ventilation. Ragna wanted the same high and low system she had used: intake at the floor, exhaust near the ceiling, with shutters to control flow. Pater wanted a single combined shaft that could be cleared from inside the cache rather than from the exposed exterior surface. You crawled across ice in the dark, he said, at 38 below, with a rope around your waist to clear a vent. The vent froze. The vent froze because it was accessible only from outside. If the shaft runs through the interior wall, a pipe, a wooden channel, a gap in the masonry, the operator clears it from inside. Warm air, dry hands, no rope. Ragna looked at his drawing. The combined shaft was narrower, which meant it could be blocked more easily by debris or ice. But it was accessible from the heated side of the structure, which meant a blockage could be detected and cleared before condensation became a problem. "You are right," she said. Petter did not acknowledge the concession. He was already drawing the next modification: removable vent caps with spring-loaded hinges that fell open when ice weight was removed, allowing a person inside the cache to push a rod through the shaft and dislodge the frozen cap from below. They worked through March. The drawings multiplied across the table, covering the design variations: hillside caches, bermed caches built against existing structures, standalone buried vaults for larger operations. Each one was labeled with its capacity, its material requirements, and the number of labor days needed for construction. Pater numbered the drawings and signed them, not with his name alone, with both their names, side by side, in the lower right corner. "You designed the principle," he said. "I designed the joints. The drawings belong to both." They held the first instructional gathering in April, when the ground had thawed enough to demonstrate. Ragna and Pater set up a teaching site on the slope behind the schoolhouse. They dug a model excavation, while 4 feet deep, 8 feet long, and demonstrated the construction sequence in a miniature. Pater drove the stakes and set the first frame. Ragna mixed the clay packing for the waterproof layer. Together they installed the drain channel, laid the ventilation shaft, and stacked 6 billets inside to show the air gap spacing. Then Pater did something Ragna did not expect. He deliberately flooded the model drain by pouring 4 buckets of water into the upper end. The water filled the channel, backed up at the exit, and pooled on the vault floor. The 6 billets sat in an inch of standing water. "This," Pater said to the 14 people watching, "is what happens when the drain slope is insufficient or the exit is blocked." He pointed at the pooled water. Every billet touching this water will be worse than if it had been stored outside. The vault does not tolerate carelessness. If the drain fails, the vault becomes a well. He cleared the blockage. The water drained in 90 seconds. The floor was wet, but clearing. The drain is the vault's most important feature, he said. Not the roof, not the ventilation, not the hatch, the drain. If you build nothing else correctly, build the drain. Ragna watched him teach and saw something she had not recognized during the months of construction. Peter Kvama was not a man who had helped a widow build a cellar. He was a man who had been waiting for a design worth teaching. His railway career had ended with the knee. His carpentry practice had narrowed to small repairs and consultations. He lived alone in a cabin that was well built, but empty of everything except tools and memories of the work that had once justified his knowledge. Ragna's vault had given him something no amount of sympathy or small jobs could provide, a structure complicated enough to require everything he knew and a student capable of learning everything he taught. He introduced Ragna to the gathered audience not as the widow who had built the vault, but as the designer. "I taught her the joints," he said. "She taught me what the joints were for." The teaching expanded through the summer of 1887. Ragna supervised 7 installations across the settlement, each one adapted to the specific terrain, soil type, and household capacity of the site. The schoolhouse cache was built into the slope behind the building, with a 4-cord capacity and an interior access door cut through the foundation. Ven's household cache was larger, 8 cords, bermed against the north wall of his barn, with a covered passage connecting to his kitchen. Clara's family installed a hillside store near the creek, using the natural drainage of the slope to eliminate the need for a separate channel. Each installation taught Ragna something the original vault had not. Different soils behaved differently under load. The heavy clay near the creek required wider post footings than the gravelly terrace beneath her own cabin. Different roof covers settled at different rates. Sod compressed more in the first month than in the following 6, which meant the initial clearance height had to account for that settlement. Different families had different capacities for maintenance. Some would inspect their vents weekly, others would forget for a month, and the design had to tolerate neglect without catastrophic failure. She taught by demonstration, the way Peter taught her. She blocked a model vent and showed residents the condensation that formed within hours. She loaded one test stack badly, billets jammed tight without air gaps, and opened it after 2 weeks to show the mold beginning at the contact points. She deliberately omitted the drain from one model bay and poured water into it to show how quickly standing moisture destroyed stored wood. The failures were more instructive than the successes. When people saw mold on a billet that had been stored for 2 weeks without air gaps, they understood air gaps. When they saw water pooling on a drainless floor, they understood drainage. When they watched condensation bead on an unvented ceiling, they understood ventilation. The principles were simple. The consequences of ignoring them were visible. Clara became Ragna's operational partner without ceremony or announcement. It happened the way partnerships happen on the frontier, through shared work repeated often enough that the division of labor becomes an arrangement, and the arrangement becomes a structure. Clara organized the labor for each installation. She recruited volunteers, scheduled work bees, coordinated tool sharing, and managed the food that fueled the building crews. Ragna inspected each design, checked the soil and drainage, reviewed the measurements, and maintained the material lists. Between them, the 7 installations were completed in 4 months. Peter trained 2 younger carpenters, men in their 20s who had homesteading experience but no formal construction training. He taught them the way he had taught Ragna. 1 demonstration, 1 repetition, 1 correction, move on. The younger men carried the physical labor he could no longer perform, and he directed them from a chair or a stump with the focused patience of a man who understood that his knowledge was worth more than his muscles. Venn established a township winter committee. The committee's authority was informal. The township had no charter for emergency fuel management, but Venn's endorsement gave it practical weight. The committee's first act was to require that every household report its fuel storage method and estimated winter reserve before October 15th. The requirement was unenforceable, but every family complied because the memory of the ice storm was 4 months old and no one had forgotten what unpreparedness looked like. The winter of 1887 to 88 began mildly. November was cold but dry. December brought snow but no significant ice. The new caches performed without drama. Fuel remained accessible. Temperatures held stable. Drains ran clear. The committee reported no shortages through Christmas. January opened warm. The 12th of January, 1888, began with temperatures that felt like early spring. Children walked to the schoolhouse without coats. Farmers who had been feeding livestock inside opened barn doors and let animals into the yards. The air was calm. The sun was bright, and the comfort of a January thaw after a hard autumn felt earned. The wind shifted in the early afternoon. It came from the northwest, and it came fast. The temperature dropped from above freezing to below zero within minutes. Snow arrived horizontally, not falling from the sky, but driving parallel to the ground, carried by wind that made standing difficult and walking between buildings potentially lethal. Visibility collapsed. A person standing in a doorway could not see the barn 30 feet away. The children's blizzard, as it would be called, struck the northern plains with a speed and ferocity that the mild morning had made impossible to anticipate. Across the territory, the storm caught people in the open, children walking home from school, farmers between house and barn, travelers on roads that disappeared in minutes. The death toll across the region reached into the hundreds. In the fictional settlement north of Brookings, the storm arrived while the school was in session. 31 children from 12 families sat in the schoolhouse with the teacher, Erickson, and 3 mothers who had come for the midday reading recital. The morning had been warm enough that several children had left their coats at home. The wind hit the building at 1:30. The windows shook. Snow drove through gaps in the siding that no one had noticed because no one noticed gaps in warm weather. The stove, which had been burning at a low draft because the room was comfortable, could not keep pace with the heat being stripped from the walls by the wind. Erickson looked out the window and saw nothing. White. Moving white. He could not see the privy 12 feet from the door. He told the children to stay inside. Ragna was at the schoolhouse. She had come for the recital and had been sitting near the back when the wind struck. Pater was at Venn's store, a quarter-mile east. Clara was at home with Ruth. The distances were short. The distances were also impassable. The schoolhouse cache was 40 feet from the building, in the slope behind it. Ragna had supervised its construction in June. It held 4 cords, accessible through a door in the hillside, and connected to the school foundation by a covered passage that Pater had insisted on despite Erickson's objection that the passage was unnecessary expense. The passage was not unnecessary now. Ragna opened the interior door, the door that led from the schoolhouse basement into the covered passage. The passage was 4 feet wide and 30 feet long, framed with salvaged posts and roofed with planks. It smelled of earth and cold stone. At the far end, the cache door opened into the 4-cord store. The wood was dry. The air was still. The thermometer Ragna had installed on the center post read 36 degrees. She began carrying billets through the passage into the schoolhouse. The stove consumed them at a rate she had never seen, not because the wood burned faster, but because the heat loss through the walls demanded more fuel per hour than any test or calculation had predicted. Wind pulled warmth out of the building the way the building pulled warmth out of the stove, and the balance between input and loss was narrower than she had ever measured. She applied Pater's lessons without Pater. Control the load. The children formed a line in the passage, passing billets hand to hand from the cache to the stove. Ragna directed them to take from alternating bays, 2 from the left, 2 from the right, preserving the end columns that kept each row stable. An 8-year-old named Henrik asked why they could not just grab the closest ones. Ragna showed him. She pulled 3 billets from the same end of one row, and the remaining billets shifted toward the gap, tilting against the wall. One more removal would have sent the row collapsing across the floor of the cache. Take from both sides, she said. The wood holds itself up. Give water an exit. 34 people, 31 children and 3 adults, plus Ragna, breathed, perspired, and tracked snow into the schoolhouse for hours. The melted snow from boots and coats pooled on the floor and ran toward the lowest point, which was the passage entrance. Ragna opened the cache's exterior vent, accessible from inside per Pater's redesign, and directed the meltwater along the passage floor toward the cache drain. The drain was built into the slope. It carried the water out through the hillside and away from the stored wood. Protect access. Ragna tied a rope from the schoolhouse door to the privy, from the privy to the livestock shelter, and from the shelter to the cache's exterior door, not because anyone would use the exterior door in the storm, but because if the interior passage became blocked, there was a backup route. The rope was 6 feet off the ground, tied to posts at each anchor point, taut enough to hold weight but loose enough to follow by hand. The storm lasted through the night. The schoolhouse cache carried 31 children and 4 adults through 18 hours of wind and cold that would have emptied the building's indoor fuel supply in 3. Erickson burned 2 3/4 cords, more than he would normally use in 2 weeks. The stove never went out. The room never dropped below 51 degrees. The children slept on the floor in rows, wrapped in coats and curtains, and a tablecloth Erickson pulled from the storage closet. And the sound in the room was the sound of breathing, and the tick of the stove, and the wind outside trying to find a way through walls that held because the heat behind them did not stop. When the storm broke the next morning, Ragna opened the schoolhouse door. The world was white and changed. Drifts reached the eaves on the north side. The privy had disappeared under snow. The rope lines she had tied were buried in sections and visible in others, sagging under the weight of ice that had formed on the fibers during the night. But the children were alive. Every one of them. Ragna walked back through the passage into the cache. 1 1/4 cords remained. The air smelled of wood and earth and the faint warmth of 34 bodies who had breathed into the space for 18 hours. She sat on the floor of the cache and closed her eyes. The silence underground was absolute. No wind, no snow, no sound except the drain channel, which was still running, a thin trickle of meltwater finding its way downhill through stone and gravel to daylight. Pater's voice arrived in the silence, as clear as if he were standing beside her. Support what is above you before taking away what is below. She had supported what was above her. 31 children, 4 adults, 18 hours. One cache built into a hillside by a woman who had learned to hold up the earth from a carpenter who could no longer kneel. Pater did not survive the month. After the blizzard, He joined Ven and two other men to search for two farm boys who had been walking between claims when the storm hit. They found the boys alive, sheltered in a shallow coulee beneath a drift, cold but conscious, and brought them back on a sled. Peter walked 3 miles in the aftermath of the storm through drifts and wind-packed snow, with his damaged knee and his 60-year-old lungs breathing air that was 15 below zero. The pneumonia began 4 days later, a cough that deepened, a fever that climbed, a heaviness in his breathing that Ragna recognized because she had heard it before in the days after Torgrim was carried home on a plank door. She brought him to her cabin. She gave him the sleeping pallet nearest the stove. She fed him broth and kept the fire steady and changed the cloths on his forehead when the fever soaked them through. And she did all of this knowing, the way frontier people always knew, that the outcome was not in her hands. On the 3rd day, Peter asked to see the drawings. Ragna brought the folio sheets to his pallet, the revised designs, the smaller caches, the combined ventilation shafts, the removable vent caps, the standardized bay dimensions were spread across the blanket. Peter turned the pages with his crushed fingers, studying each one the way he had studied Ragna's first notebook in September. Slowly, silently, with the complete attention of a man who understood that the details mattered more than the concept. He stopped on the last sheet. It was Ragna's drawing, not Peter's original heavy framing with thick posts and massive cap beams, but a lighter design. Smaller, standardized bays that families could build cooperatively, posts that 2 men could carry, cap beams that could be raised with a simple block and tackle, dimensions that fit the lumber available at any settlement store. "You stopped building my cellar," he said. "I started building ours," Ragna answered. Peter held the drawing for a long time. His breathing was audible across the room, the wet, labored sound of lungs filling with what they could not expel. Eli sat on the floor beside the pallet, holding a cup of water she had been told to offer whenever Peter's lips moved. Odd sat behind her, watching with the gravity of a child who knows that watching is the only contribution he can make. Peter set the drawing down. He looked at Ragna. "The drain is still the most important feature." "I know." "Good." He closed his eyes. His breathing continued through the night, shallow and uneven, each exhale carrying a sound that the stove could not cover. Ragna sat beside him until the lamp burned low, and then she sat in the dark, and the only light in the cabin was the orange line beneath the stove door where the fire held. He died on the 4th morning, with the drawings on the blanket beside him and Eli's cup of water still half full on the floor. Ragna folded the drawings and placed them in the folio. She wrapped Peter's folding rule and his carpenter's level in a cloth and gave them to Clara. She kept the canvas tool bag with its clinking contents, the chisels, the marking gauge, the sharpening stone, and hung it on the wall beside the kitchen hatch, where it would remain for the rest of her life. There is a particular silence that follows the death of someone who taught you how to build what saved you. It is not the silence of grief alone, though grief fills it. It is the silence of recognizing that every skill your hands now carry was placed there by hands that will never demonstrate again. The knowledge lives. The teacher does not. And the distance between those two facts is the space in which all apprenticeship eventually ends. If this story reminds you why preparation should be shared rather than hoarded, pass it to someone who needs to hear it. Copies of the revised plans traveled with the spring thaw. Clara made duplicates on butcher paper, large sheets that could be folded, mailed, or tacked to a schoolhouse wall. Ragna annotated each copy with the critical specifications: post dimensions, drain slope, ventilation shaft diameter, minimum air gaps, maximum unsupported span. Erickson added the plans to the school's reference collection alongside the almanac and the surveyor's tables. The school board copied the drawings into their correspondence with neighboring districts. A carpenter in Flandreau received a set in May and built 2 caches by August. A freight driver carried a copy to Watertown, where a woman he had never met read the dimensions and began digging. The plans did not travel as Ragna's invention or Pater's design. They traveled as information, the kind of information that spreads because it answers a question people did not know they were asking until the question nearly killed them. Voss did not accept the new order gracefully. He had collected on the assigned debts. The 6 households paid their obligations within the spring, and his note against Ragna was cleared, but the resolution had humiliated him in a way that numbers could not remedy. He had been the fuel merchant. He had controlled supply, pricing, and distribution. Now the settlement had decentralized caches, cooperative labor arrangements, and written inspection procedures that bypassed his store entirely. He responded the way a man with capital responds to competition. He began selling what he called ice-proof sheds, overbuilt roofed structures made from new lumber at 3 times the cost of a cooperative cache. He told customers that underground storage was dangerous, cave-in risk, mold, fire, and that his engineered sheds provided the same protection with none of the hazards. The sheds were not terrible. They kept rain off the wood and provided enclosed access. But they did not address the fundamental vulnerability that the ice storm had exposed: a door that could freeze shut. An exterior entrance, however well built, was still an exterior entrance. And Voss's sheds had exterior entrances because his sheds sat above the ground where his customers could see them and where Voss could charge for the visible lumber. He also attempted to claim that the vent cap hardware sold in his store was proprietary and that anyone who copied the design owed him a licensing fee. This claim collapsed when Clara produced Pater's original drawings. The ones signed with both Pater's and Rana's names dated months before Voss began stocking vent hardware and presented them to the township committee. Voss's campaign continued through the summer of 1888. He refused to sell materials to families building cooperative caches. He offered discounted rates on his sheds to anyone who agreed not to participate in the cache program. He told new settlers that the underground method was experimental and unproven, despite the evidence of 2 winters and 7 completed installations. Ragna did not argue with him publicly. She did not counter his claims in the store. She did not campaign against his sheds. She continued building caches for families who asked, continued teaching the principles to anyone who wanted to learn, and continued maintaining the original vault beneath her cabin with the same methodical attention she had given it since October of 1886. The competition between Voss's commercial approach and the cooperative cache system would not resolve itself through argument. It would resolve itself through winter, and winter was 5 months away. The second winter answered the question. Voss's sheds performed adequately through November and December. The roof structures kept rain and snow off the stacked wood, and the enclosed walls reduced wind exposure. Customers who had purchased them reported dry billets, accessible entrances, and the satisfaction of owning a visible, well-built structure that announced to every passing neighbor that the household had prepared. The cooperative caches performed without incident. Families who had built hillside stores or berm structures reported stable temperatures, dry wood, and functional drains. The inspection routine that Ven's committee had established, monthly checks of vents, drains, and interior moisture, caught 2 minor problems before they became serious. A blocked drain at the church cache was cleared in an afternoon. A settling roof plank at Clara's hillside store was shimmed with a wedge that Ragna cut and fitted in 20 minutes. The difference revealed itself in February. A thaw-freeze cycle. Warmer air followed by a sharp, cold snap. Coated exterior surfaces across the settlement with a thin but persistent glaze. Not the catastrophic ice storm of the previous December. A routine event. The kind of freeze that happened 2 or 3 times each winter and that everyone had always managed without difficulty. Voss's sheds had exterior doors. The doors froze, not dramatically, not catastrophically. The ice was thin, less than a quarter inch on most surfaces. An adult with a hammer could break through it in 10 minutes. But 10 minutes of hammering at an ice-sealed door in 12 below air was 10 minutes of exposed hands, frozen hinges, and the growing awareness that the structure, which was supposed to solve the access problem, had reproduced it. 3 of Voss's customers came to the store to complain. Voss told them the ice was exceptional. They told him it was February. He offered replacement hinge hardware with wider tolerances. They asked why the door was on the outside. He had no answer for that because the answer was architectural, and the architecture was Ragna's. The cooperative caches with their interior access points opened without resistance. Families descended through kitchen hatches, walked through covered passages, or entered through foundation doors that had never been exposed to exterior air. The wood was there. The wood was dry. The doors worked. By March, Voss had stopped advertising the ice-proof sheds. He continued selling lumber. He was still the only supplier. But he no longer claimed that above-ground storage was superior to below-ground. The market had spoken, and the market spoke in frozen hinges and 10-minute delays that the cooperative system did not produce. The hostile skeptic's conversion did not arrive as a single moment of surrender. It arrived in stages, each one extracted from Voss by circumstances he could not control. The first stage was economic. The cooperative cash system reduced his winter fuel brokerage by roughly 40%. Families who stored their own wood did not need to purchase emergency fuel from his commercial lot at crisis prices. The premium he had charged during past shortages, the markup that funded his operation, evaporated as decentralized reserves made centralized supply less necessary. He adjusted by selling more hardware, more construction materials, and more provisions, but the fuel margin had been his most reliable winter income. The second stage was structural. In the autumn of 1888, the roof of Voss's commercial shed partially collapsed. The shed was well built. Voss hired competent labor, but the design concentrated the weight of the roof, the accumulated snow, and the lateral pressure of the wind on 4 main posts. One post had been set on soil without a stone footing. The soil beneath it, saturated by meltwater that the shed's impervious roof directed downward along the walls, compressed under the load. The post settled 3 inches. The roof beam tilted. 2 connecting joints separated. A section of roofing planks buckled inward, and the snow load above punched through the gap and buried the upper course of the stored wood. Voss repaired the roof. He did not address the drainage. The shed had been designed to keep water out, not to manage the water that inevitably found its way in. Meltwater from the collapsed section ran along the floor, found the lowest point, and pooled beneath the stacked billets. The bottom course absorbed the moisture. The freeze that followed locked those billets to the floor. The third stage was personal. His daughter, Maren, 14 years old, quiet in the manner of children who grow up observing a parent's authority and learning to navigate around it, worked in the commercial shed on winter afternoons, sorting orders, marking billets for delivery, and maintaining the inventory ledger that Voss used to track his stock. She was competent and thorough, and Voss trusted her with the work because she performed it without error and without complaint. On an evening in late January, Myron was working alone in the shed office, a small partitioned space at the front of the structure, heated by a box stove that drew from the commercial pile. The stove consumed the last of the office supply. Myron went into the main storage area to retrieve more wood. The upper courses were accessible. The lower courses, the ones that had absorbed meltwater and frozen to the floor, were not. Myron pulled billets from the upper stack, but the upper stack was the fast-depleting portion that Voss had been selling throughout the season. Only 6 billets remained above the frozen lower course. She carried 3 to the office stove. She burned them. The stove consumed the 3 billets in 2 hours. The temperature in the office began to fall. She returned to the storage area. 3 billets remained. The shed door had frozen shut, not with the quarter-inch glaze that had embarrassed his customers the previous winter. A wet snowfall had packed against the door's exterior face, and the temperature drop behind it had bonded the snow to the wood. Myron pushed. The door shifted 1/8 of an inch. She pushed harder. The door held. She burned the remaining 3 billets. Then she wrapped herself in the canvas tarpaulin that covered the sorting table and sat beside the stove while the fire died. Voss found her 2 hours later. He had come to close the shed for the night and discovered the frozen door. He broke through it with a pry bar, 10 minutes of hammering in the dark, his breath clouding, his hands shaking with a force that was not entirely cold. Myron was stiff with chill, but conscious. The office temperature had dropped to 22 degrees. Another hour without fuel, and the temperature would have continued falling. The outcome at 12 degrees, at 5, at below 0. Voss could calculate that sequence as well as anyone, and the numbers led to a conclusion he could not face. He brought Myron home. He warmed her. He sat beside her bed until her color returned, and her hands stopped shaking, and she fell asleep with the slow, deep breathing of a child whose body has decided the emergency is over. Then he put on his coat and walked to Ragna's cabin. He knocked. It was after 10 o'clock. The settlement was dark except for the scattered glow of stove light through frosted windows. Ragna opened the door. She looked at Voss, at his face, which carried something she had never seen on it before, something that resembled the expression Venn had worn in the store when he told 31 people he had mistaken habit for knowledge. "I need dry wood," Voss said. Myron was in the shed. The door froze. Ragna did not ask questions. She opened the hatch, descended the ladder, and brought up enough billets for the night, 8 pieces bundled with twine, warm from the vault's stable air. She handed them to Voss. He took them. His hands closed around the billets with the grip of a man holding something he had spent 2 years dismissing. "In the morning," Ragna said, "come help me load the school reserve." Voss looked at her. The request was not a condition. It was not a bargain. It was an invitation into the system he had fought, offered at the moment when his own system had nearly killed his daughter, and the distinction between the two approaches could not be argued away. "I will come," he said. He came. He arrived at 7 o'clock with a sled and a length of rope. He did not speak about the previous night. He did not explain or apologize or revise his public position. He loaded billets through the schoolhouse passage with the same efficiency he brought to every task, and when the school reserve was full, he loaded the church cache, and when the church cache was full, he helped Ragna inspect the Hume family store and clear a slow drain that had accumulated silt over the winter. At noon, Ragna offered him coffee. They sat at her table, the same table where he had placed his leather case and his written offer 2 years earlier, the same table where she had slid the signed acknowledgments across to him and watched his jaw tighten. Voss held the cup in both hands. His fingers were red from the morning's work. "I thought owning the wood made me the fuel man," he he said. He set the cup down. I was wrong about what had to be owned. He did not say more. The acknowledgement was compressed into 2 sentences, and the compression was appropriate because Voss was not a man who expanded his feelings into language. He expressed them through action. The action that morning had been loading wood for a school his daughter attended into a cache built by a woman he had tried to bankrupt, using a design drawn by a carpenter he had dismissed. Within the month, Voss donated salvaged timbers from his collapsed shed roof for the construction of 2 public caches, one beside the road at the midway point between the settlement and Brookings, and one near the river crossing, where travelers were most vulnerable. He did not donate the timbers generously. He donated them the way he conducted all business, with an accounting of their value, an expectation of recognition, and a receipt that Clara filed in the Township Committee records. But he donated them. And the caches were built, and the timbers that had once held up a roof designed to keep water out now held up a roof designed to keep wood dry. And the difference between those 2 intentions was the difference between Voss's shed and Ragna's vault. And Voss understood that difference now because his daughter had taught it to him in a language colder than words. By the mid-1890s, the system had reached its full local expression. 11 household caches operated across the settlement. 3 public reserves served communal needs: the schoolhouse, the church, and the midway shelter. Each cache had written inspection dates posted inside on a board that Ragna had designed. A simple grid listing the month, the inspector's name, the vent status, the drain status, and the moisture reading from the test billet. The moisture reading was the most important entry. Ragna could not measure moisture content the way a modern instrument would. Instead, she used the methods available to her, the same methods she had used since the first autumn on the claim. Weight. A test billet of known dry weight was kept in each cache, weighed monthly on a beam scale, and the difference recorded. Sound. A dry billet rang when tapped against stone. A wet billet thudded. Appearance. Seasoned wood showed pale, open grain at the split face, while wet wood darkened at the edges and closed its pores. Test burning. Once per quarter, a test billet was burned on the schoolhouse stove, while residents observed the flame, the smoke, and the time to full combustion. These were not precise measurements. They were comparative observations, repeated consistently over years, that built a shared understanding of what dry meant and what too wet looked like. The system worked not because it was scientific in the modern sense, but because it was systematic. The same checks, performed in the same order by people who had been trained to notice the same indicators. The autumn fuel preparation became a communal event. Each September, families opened their caches, removed old stock, inspected the structures, and loaded fresh seasoned wood. The rotation ensured that no cache contained billets older than 2 seasons, and the old stock was burned first during the early autumn when heating demands were light and any moisture in the aging wood could be tolerated. The storm roster was Ven's contribution. He compiled a list of every isolated resident in the district tree, widows, elderly couples, families on distant claims, and assigned each one a neighbor responsible for checking their fuel and heat status after any significant weather event. The roster was updated each autumn and posted in the schoolhouse, the store, and the church. The system was imperfect. People forgot. Neighbors quarreled. Assignments went unmet. But the roster existed, and its existence meant that isolation was no longer private. If someone froze, someone else was responsible for having failed to check. Ragna refused to call the caches by her name. Ven proposed Brika cellars at a committee meeting. Ragna said the cellars belonged to the people who built them and the carpenter who designed the joints. The township records adopted the label she suggested, Winter Fuel Vaults. The name was functional, unmemorable, and exactly right. The community that emerged from the cash system was not warmer or kinder than the one that had existed before. People still quarreled. Voss still charged high prices. Clara still demanded written contracts for every exchange. Venn still inspected properties with the authority of a man who had survived things that killed others. What changed was the relationship between preparation and community. Before the ice storm, fuel storage had been private. Each family's reserve was its own concern, managed by its own labor, vulnerable to its own mistakes. The ice storm demonstrated that private reserves could fail simultaneously, and that simultaneous failure produced a crisis no individual family could survive alone. The cash system made preparation communal without making it collective. Each family owned its own cash. Each family stocked its own wood. Each family maintained its own structure. But the designs were shared, the inspections were shared, the storm roster was shared. The schoolhouse reserve was filled first each autumn before any household cash because the school was where the children gathered, and the children were what everyone was actually protecting. Each autumn, families inspected one another's vents and drains. The inspection was not official and not required. It happened because Clara organized it, because Venn endorsed it, and because the memory of the ice storm remained vivid enough that the effort of checking a neighbor's drain felt like insurance rather than imposition. Widowed, elderly, and injured residents received fuel allocations from the public reserves. The allocations were not charity. They were documented, accounted for, and repaid in labor, goods, or future wood when circumstances allowed. Ragna had learned from her encounter with Voss that charity created dependency and resentment, and she insisted that every allocation carry a reciprocal obligation, however small. No single person controlled the entire reserve. This was the principle that Ragna guarded most fiercely. When the committee proposed centralizing the public reserves under a single manager, a proposal that Voss supported for obvious reasons, Ragna argued against it with the only authority she trusted: arithmetic. One manager means one failure point, she said. One frozen door, one blocked drain, one missed inspection. If the school cash fails, the church cash operates. If the church cash fails, the midway shelter holds. If one person controls all three fail when that person fails. The committee voted to keep the reserves separate. Voss abstained. The years compressed, the way years compress when the urgent work is finished, and what remains is the steady labor of maintenance and teaching and the slow accumulation of ordinary days. Ragna completed proof on her homestead in the spring of 1887. The hearing was brief. The examiner reviewed her improvements, the cabin, the vault, the cultivated acres, the fencing, and granted the patent. The land was hers, not Voss's, not the territories. Hers. She and Clara operated a small service through the 1890s, winter storage consultation and farm accounting. Clara kept the books. Ragna inspected the sites. They charged fair rates and maintained a waiting list that grew each autumn as word of the cash system spread through the river settlements. The work was not glamorous. It involved walking slopes, testing soil, measuring drainage fall, and explaining the same principles to new families who asked the same questions that Ragna had asked herself in the food cellar during the August thunderstorm. Why does the earth stay dry when the surface is wet? Why does the vault stay above freezing when the air is below zero? Why does the drain matter more than the roof? She answered each time with the patience of someone who understood that the question was the beginning of the knowledge, not the end. Eli grew into the kind of young woman the frontier needed and rarely acknowledged. She was quiet, observant, and possessed of a memory that retained numbers the way other people's memories retained faces. She became a school teacher, not by attending a normal school, which the family could not afford, but by apprenticing with Erickson and passing the county examination at 17. Her first act as a teacher was to add a weather observation column to the school register. Each morning, a student recorded the temperature, wind direction, sky condition, and barometer reading. The data accumulated across years, and the accumulation became the settlement's first continuous weather record. Odd became a carpenter. The tools on the wall beside the kitchen hatch, Pater's chisels, his marking gauge, his sharpening stone, Satauf, became Odd's tools when his hands were large enough to hold them. He specialized in barns, drains, and storm shelters. He built things that went into the ground or stood against the wind, and he built them the way Pater had taught his mother to build. One demonstration, one repetition, one correction, move on. Ragna enlarged the cabin in 1892. She added a room to the south and a covered porch to the east, building around the original structure rather than over it. The kitchen hatch remained in its original position. The vault beneath it still functioned, not for 30 cords, which was no longer necessary now that decentralized caches served the settlement, but for 5 cords of household reserve, a root cellar, a tool storage area, and a small emergency supply that she maintained with the same methodical attention she had given the full vault during the ice storm. The original vault's larger wing, the storage chamber that extended into the terrace slope, became a community workshop and teaching space. Families brought children there to learn the principles. Ragna demonstrated drainage, ventilation, and load distribution the way Pater had demonstrated them to her, by flooding a model drain, blocking a model vent, and overloading a model stack until the failure was visible and the lesson was permanent. She kept one of Pater's marked test billets above the kitchen hatch. It had been part of the original comparison set. The 6 billets placed in bay 2 against 6 in Ven's outdoor stack. One side of the billet was dark from the months of outdoor exposure before the vault was completed. The split interior remained pale. The contrast, dark bark face, light split grain, was the difference between wood that had been left in the weather and wood that had been brought inside. The billet hung on a nail above the hatch, like other people hung almanacs or scripture verses, and the lesson it taught was simpler than any verse. What you protect survives. August Venn continued inspecting caches until his health failed. His right shoulder never fully recovered from the fall on the ice road, and the arm that had hung in a sling through the crisis continued to ache in cold weather for the rest of his life. He inspected vents with his left hand, opening caps and feeling for airflow the way Pater had felt for soil composition, with fingertips that carried knowledge the eyes could not verify. He died in 1895, in his own house beside a stove that burned dry wood from a cache he had once said would never work. The township committee named the Midway shelter the Venn cache. He would have objected to the sentimentality. He did not have the opportunity. Clara preserved Pater's original level and folding rule. She kept them in a cloth-lined box on the mantel of her kitchen, the kitchen that had served as a warming station during the ice storm, the kitchen whose cache had held 4 cords through 2 winters without a single failed inspection. The level and the rule were tools, not relics, and Clara used them. She leveled her own shelving. She measured her own drainage channels. She built things with the tools of a man she had never met before. September of 1886, and whose knowledge now lived in her hands as surely as it lived in Ragna's. Voss never became warm. He never offered a speech of gratitude or a public acknowledgement beyond the 2 sentences he had spoken at Ragna's table. What he offered instead was consistency. He paid his cooperative dues on time. He donated timbers when requested. He maintained his own household cache. Built in 1889, inspected monthly, drained properly, ventilated per specification with the same precision he applied to his store accounts. And he was always the first to deliver timbers after a storm. Not because he cared about the community's welfare in the way Ragna cared about it, but because he understood finally that the community's welfare was the infrastructure on which his business depended. A frozen settlement did not buy provisions. A heated settlement did. His daughter Marin married a carpenter from Flandreau and moved south. She took a copy of the vault drawings with her. The copy was the one Voss had kept in his office, folded, annotated in his handwriting with cost estimates and material sources, carried in the same leather case that had once held the offer to buy Ragna's claim. Ragna lived out her life on the claim she nearly lost. A dramatized final date places her death in 1932, in her 70s. She had seen automobiles replace wagons, telephones replace fence line messages, and electricity replace the lamp oil that Voss had once refused to sell her on credit. She had watched the prairie fill with farms that burned coal instead of cottonwood, and she had watched the caches lose their urgency as supply chains shortened and fuel became purchasable rather than personally stored. The vault beneath her kitchen remained. The hatch opened as smoothly as it had in 1886. The ladder rungs had been replaced twice. The drain still ran clear. The ventilation shaft, the one she had cleared in the dark at 38 below, with a rope around her waist, drew air without interruption. In her last years, she used the vault mainly for potatoes, tools, and 2 cords of emergency wood she stacked each autumn from habit rather than necessity. Eli teased her about it. "The store delivers coal to the door, Mama." Ragna did not stop stacking the wood. Pater's test billet hung above the hatch, dark on one side, pale on the other. Her children left the hatch in place even after the main vault was no longer needed for its original purpose. Odd, by then a carpenter with his own business, reinforced the ladder and repacked the hatch rim with new wool felt. Eli added a small brass plate to the frame. Brecka Kavama Vault, 1886. The plate was the only marker. There was no monument, no historical sign, no commemorative event. The vault had done what it was built to do, and what it was built to do had become so ordinary that the doing of it no longer seemed remarkable. The most meaningful legacy was procedural. Every autumn, a child from the school was assigned to open the public cache, inspect the first stack, and confirm that the emergency door moved freely. The child did not know why the inspection had begun. The child did it because it was on the list, and the list had always been there, and the adults who maintained the list had learned the reason from adults who had learned it from a woman, who had learned it from a carpenter, who had learned it from the earth. The method became ordinary enough that later residents forgot why the inspection began. This is what successful preparation looks like. It becomes invisible. The danger it prevents never arrives, and the absence of danger feels like proof that the preparation was unnecessary. Only the people who lived through the crisis know otherwise, and those people eventually die. And what remains is the list on the schoolhouse wall and the child who opens the door each September without knowing that the door exists because a woman once crawled across ice in the dark to keep it open. Return to the night of the ice storm. Rain has stopped. The clouds have broken along the western horizon, and a moon the color of bone has risen above the frozen prairie. The light it casts is sharp and pitiless, and every surface it touches throws it back. The fence wires, the wagon beds, the roads, the rooftops, and the woodpiles. The woodpiles shine. They are glass monuments. Axe marks scar the ice where men struck for hours and could not reach what they needed. The marks are shallow, chipped, incomplete, the evidence of labor that spent itself against a surface it could not break. August Venn's voice carries across the months the way voices carry across frozen ground. Clear, certain, wrong. Rain in December loosens winter. It does not lock it. Inside the cabin, the air's warm. Ragna Breck kneels on the kitchen floor. Her hands are cracked and wrapped. Her back carries the weight of 2,000 barrow loads and 7 weeks of digging and every billet she has passed through the hatch since morning. Below her, the vault is quiet. The drain runs. The ventilation breathes. 18 1/4 cords stand in numbered bays, dry and pale, waiting. She lifts the hatch. Dry air rises through the opening. It smells of split wood and earth and stone. The smell of a root cellar in summer, carried into the deepest cold of the year by the same principle her father taught her beside a frost-white door in Minnesota. Eli waits beside the stove with both hands extended. Odd holds a piece of kindling no thicker than his thumb. Ragna reaches into the dark and brings up one billet. She places it in her daughter's hands. Eli carries it to the stove. Odd feeds the kindling beneath it. Outside, 30 frozen yards are silent beneath ice. Moonlight runs along the glaze and finds nothing that moves. Inside, the first flame travels along the pale grain of a log that winter never touched.